Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I'd been doing security at Riverside Memorial Cemetery for about 8 months when everything started getting weird. The job itself was pretty straightforward. Patrol the grounds from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Make sure nobody jumped the fence to vandalize headstones or drink beer among the graves. Most nights I'd just walk my routes, check the gates, listen to podcasts through one earbud while keeping the other ear open for trouble. The cemetery covered about 40 acres, divided into 12 sections with different names like Garden of Peace and Eternal Rest. Each section had its own entrance gate with heavy padlocks that I'd check twice per shift. The pay was decent for what it was, and honestly, dead people made better company than some of the living folks I'd dealt with at my previous warehouse job. The first time I heard the keys, I was doing my 2 a.m. round through the oldest part of the cemetery, where the headstones dated back to the 1890s. It was a Thursday in early October, one of those nights where the fog rolled in thick enough that my flashlight beam only cut about 10 feet ahead. I'd just finished checking the north gate padlock when I heard it, the distinct metallic jingle of keys on a ring, maybe 30 feet behind me. Not just a random clink, but that specific rhythm you get when someone's walking with keys attached to their belt. I spun around immediately, flashlight sweeping the path, calling out the standard, "Security! This is private property." But there was nothing. Just fog swirling through my light beam and row after row of weathered headstones. I stood there for a good minute, listening hard, but heard only the distant hum of traffic from the highway about a mile away. I figured maybe it was my own keys echoing off the monuments. Sound does weird things in fog. I kept walking, heading toward the Garden of Remembrance section, but about 5 minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was closer, maybe 15 feet to my left, and accompanied by another sound that made me stop dead in my tracks, the metallic scrape and click of a padlock being opened. The thing is, I could see the gate from where I stood. I trained my flashlight directly on it, and the padlock was right there, still closed, still secure. I walked over and physically checked it, tugging hard to make sure. Locked tight, just like always. But I'd heard what I'd heard. That wasn't my imagination. I'd been checking locks for 8 months. I knew exactly what they sounded like when someone opened them. The rest of that shift, I kept my flashlight on constant sweep mode, checking behind me every few steps. The sounds didn't come back that night, but I spent the remaining hours until dawn, with this uncomfortable tightness in my chest. I even called my supervisor, Greg, around 4 a.m., just to have another human voice in my ear. Told him I'd heard some noises, might be someone trying to mess with the gates. He said he'd check the security cameras in the morning, see if they picked up anyone, though we both knew the cameras only covered the main entrance and the administration building, not the grounds themselves. When my shift ended and the groundskeepers started arriving, I mentioned the noises to Phil, the head groundskeeper who'd been there for 15 years. He just shrugged and said raccoons sometimes made weird noises, especially during mating season. But I knew the difference between animal sounds and metal on metal. For the next 3 nights, nothing happened. I started to think maybe I'd been more tired than I realized. Maybe my mind was playing tricks after too many hours of silence and darkness. But then Monday night came, and with it something that made me seriously consider putting in my 2 weeks' notice. I was checking the locks in Section 7, near where they kept all the veteran graves with their uniform white markers stretching in perfect rows. The moon was full that night, bright enough that I could have done my rounds without the flashlight if I wanted. I just finished testing the lock on the east gate when I heard the keys again, but this time they weren't behind me or beside me. They were matching my pace exactly, like an echo that came half a second too late. Every step I took, I'd hear my footfall, then immediately after, the jingle. Step, jingle, step, jingle. I stopped walking. The jingling stopped too, but not right away. It continued for 2 more steps, like whoever was carrying those keys hadn't expected me to stop so suddenly. That's when things got genuinely terrifying. I heard the unmistakable sound of a padlock being unlocked, that specific sequence of the key sliding in, the mechanism turning, the shackle popping open, coming from the gate I'd just checked 10 seconds ago. I whipped around and ran back, my flashlight bouncing wildly, my breath coming in short bursts. The gate was still locked. I grabbed it, shook it hard enough to make the whole fence section rattle, but it didn't budge. The padlock was secure, cold to the touch, showing no signs that anyone had tampered with it. But while I was standing there trying to make sense of what was happening, I heard another lock opening behind me, then another, off to my right, then two more, simultaneously from different directions. It was like someone, or several someones, were going through the cemetery, unlocking every gate, except the gates remained locked. The sounds were so clear, so precise, that I could tell the difference between the older padlocks with their rustier mechanisms and the newer ones we'd installed last spring. I pulled out my phone and started recording audio, thinking maybe I was losing my mind and needed proof that this was actually happening. The recording picked up my heavy breathing, my footsteps on the gravel path, and yes, the jingling keys and the clicking locks. Clear as day. I sent the audio file to Greg right then, not caring that it was 1:47 a.m. Then I did something that probably went against protocol, but I didn't care anymore. I abandoned my usual route and headed straight for the maintenance shed where we kept spare equipment. Inside, I grabbed the biggest flashlight we had, one of those massive mag lights that doubled as a club, and went back out. The sounds followed me the entire way, keys jingling in that steady rhythm of someone walking, locks clicking open and shut. But now there was something else too. Footsteps on gravel, matching mine but slightly offset, like someone was walking right beside me but staying just out of sight. I need to explain something about cemetery paths. They're covered in very specific gravel, these small white stones that make a distinct crunching sound when you walk on them. There's no way to walk silently on those paths. Every groundskeeper and security guard who works there develops a rhythm to their walk that becomes as familiar as their voice. What I was hearing wasn't an echo of my own steps. The pattern was different. Longer strides, heavier footfalls, like someone taller and bigger than me was keeping pace alongside. I stopped abruptly and shone both flashlights in a wide arc around me. Nothing. Nobody. But the footsteps continued for 3 more paces before stopping, and they were coming from a spot maybe 6 feet to my left, where there was nothing but empty path and air. I actually walked over to that exact spot, waving my hand through the space, feeling like an idiot but needing to be sure. There was nothing there, but the gravel at that spot was disturbed, little divots in the stones like someone had just walked through. At that point, I made a decision that probably saved my sanity. I called the police. Not 911, but the non-emergency line, and I told them I was a security guard at Riverside Memorial, and I had strong reason to believe someone was trespassing on the grounds, possibly multiple people. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher while I waited, standing in the middle of the path with both flashlights on, turning in slow circles. The sounds had stopped completely the moment I made the call. Like whatever was making them knew I'd brought in outside help. 2 officers showed up about 12 minutes later, Officers Brennan and Foster according to their badges. I walked them through what I'd been hearing, played them the audio recording on my phone. Brennan, the older of the two, listened carefully and said it definitely sounded like keys and locks, but Foster seemed skeptical, kept asking if I'd been drinking or if I was on any medication. They did a full sweep of the cemetery with me, checking every single gate, looking for any signs of forced entry or tampering. We spent almost an hour going through all 12 sections, and they found absolutely nothing out of place. But here's the thing that made Officer Brennan pause. When we got to Section 4, near the Children's Memorial area, he stopped and asked me if I noticed anything unusual about the locks. I looked closer and realized what he meant. Every single padlock in that section was oriented differently than how I'd left them during my earlier round. Not unlocked, not tampered with, but rotated. Where I always left them with the keyhole facing down to keep rain out, they were now facing up or sideways. Brennan took photos and made notes, said it could indicate someone with a key had been through, even if they'd re-locked everything. He asked if any other guards had keys, if there was anyone who might be playing pranks. I told him only Greg and the cemetery director, Mrs. Novak, had master keys besides me, and neither of them would do something like this. After the officers left, promising to increase patrols in the area, I finished my shift in the security booth near the main entrance, refusing to do any more rounds that night. The next morning, I went straight to Mrs. Novak's office and laid everything out for her. The sounds, the recording, the police visit, the rotated locks. She listened without interrupting, then pulled out a manila folder from a filing cabinet behind her desk. Inside were incident reports dating back 8 years, all from night security guards, all describing the same thing: keys jingling, locks opening, footsteps on empty paths. 7 different guards had reported it. 3 had quit without notice. 1 had a nervous breakdown and ended up in psychiatric care for a week. Mrs. Novak told me that her father, who'd been the cemetery director before her, had experienced it too back in the 1980s. She said they'd had the locks changed 4 times, installed motion sensors that never picked up anything, even brought in a priest to bless the grounds. Nothing stopped it. But here's what she told me that changed everything. It only happened to guards who worked alone. The moment they'd switched to 2-person night shifts, the incident stopped completely. She offered me a choice: stay on with a partner, they'd bring in someone from their contract security company, or transfer to day shift with a small pay cut. I took the partner option because I needed the night differential pay for my kids' medical bills. The very next night, I was paired with a guy named Jerome, who'd been doing security for 20 years. We walked the rounds together, and absolutely nothing happened. No keys, no locks, no footsteps. Just 2 guys with flashlights walking through a quiet cemetery. It's been 6 months now, and as long as Jerome or whoever else they pair me with is there, everything stays normal. But twice, when my partner called in sick and they asked if I could handle one night solo, I heard them again within an hour. The keys, the locks, the footsteps keeping pace beside me. Both times, I just returned to the booth and waited for dawn. Mrs. Novak never pushes it. She knows what happens when someone's alone out there. We don't talk about why it happens or what it means. We just know the solution. Never patrol alone. Whatever's out there, whether it's something explainable by science or psychology or something else entirely, it doesn't like being outnumbered. And that's enough for me to never find out what would happen if I stayed out there alone long enough for it to finish whatever it's trying to do with those locks. Most people in this town know me as Detective Hayes, but 22 years on the force in Cedar Rapids had never prepared me for what I discovered that Friday in November 2022. I was 51, divorced, with 2 grown kids who barely called anymore, and I thought I'd seen everything this job could throw at me. Cedar Rapids isn't exactly a hotbed of crime. We get our share of domestic disputes, the occasional robbery, drunk drivers on weekends. I lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment near the precinct, spent my evenings watching old westerns and nursing a beer or 2. My partner had retired 6 months earlier, and I was counting down the days until I could join him. Maybe finally take that fishing trip to Alaska I'd been promising myself since the divorce. But everything changed when dispatch called about a missing 16-year-old named Ashley Carpenter, a straight-A student from Westwood High who hadn't come home from school the previous afternoon. The call came in around 9 in the morning, and by 10 I was sitting in the Carpenter's living room, looking at a girl with bright green eyes and dark curly hair smiling from a dozen family photos on the mantel. Her mother Janet kept wringing a dish towel in her hands while her father Robert paced behind the couch, his work boots leaving faint mud prints on the cream carpet. They told me Ashley always texted when she'd be late, never stayed out without permission, and had seemed perfectly normal at breakfast the day before. She'd mentioned staying after school to work on a science project with her friend Megan, but Megan told them Ashley never showed up. The last anyone saw her was walking toward the east exit of the school around 3:45 p.m. Her phone was going straight to voicemail, and none of her friends had heard from her. What really caught my attention was when Robert mentioned finding her laptop open to a chat room website he'd never seen before, something called Night Owls Connect, with messages from someone using the handle Guardian 1988. I spent the next 2 hours going through Ashley's room, which was this perfect mix of childhood and teenage years. Stuffed animals on a shelf above band posters, AP textbooks scattered across a desk covered in glittery nail polish bottles. Her laptop showed conversations going back 3 weeks with this Guardian 1988 person who claimed to be a 19-year-old college student named Daniel, who understood what it was like to feel pressure from parents and teachers. The messages started innocent enough. Complaints about homework, jokes about teachers, music recommendations. But in the last week, they'd shifted. Daniel started talking about a special place where kids could hang out without adults watching, where they could truly be themselves. He'd sent her photos of what looked like an old stone building surrounded by trees, describing it as a forgotten spot where local teens had been meeting for generations. The last message, sent the morning she disappeared, simply read, "After school today, come alone. The others are excited to meet you." By noon, I had every available officer searching the usual spots: the mall, the park, friends' houses, anywhere a teenager might go to blow off steam. But I kept coming back to those photos on Ashley's laptop. The stone building looked familiar, like something I'd seen before but couldn't quite place. I enhanced the images, studied the architecture, the way the ivy grew up one side, the peculiar shape of the windows. Then it hit me. Those weren't windows. They were ventilation grates. The building was the old maintenance shed at Hillcrest Cemetery on the outskirts of town. I'd been there once, maybe 15 years ago, for a vandalism case. The cemetery had been mostly abandoned since the new one opened across town in 2010. Only a handful of families still visiting graves there. The maintenance shed sat way in the back, hidden behind a row of massive oak trees that had to be at least 100 years old. If someone wanted to use it without being noticed, it would be the perfect spot. I drove out there alone first, wanted to scope it out before calling for backup. The cemetery gates were chained shut, but the fence had gaps where local kids had been cutting through for years. The November air was sharp and cold, dead leaves crunching under my feet as I made my way through rows of weathered headstones, some dating back to the 1800s. The farther back I went, the more overgrown everything became. Weeds choking the pathways, tree branches creating a canopy that blocked most of the afternoon sun. When I finally reached the maintenance shed, my chest tightened. Fresh tire tracks led around to the back, and the padlock on the door had been replaced with a new one, still shiny against the rusted chain. But what really made me reach for my radio was Ashley's purple backpack, the one with the rainbow patches her mother had described, sitting in the dirt beside the door. I called it in immediately, requesting backup and an ambulance on standby, then tried the door. It was locked solid, but I could hear something inside, a low humming sound like a generator running. While waiting for backup, I circled the building, checking for other entrances. Around back, I found a small window that had been boarded up, but some planks were loose. Pulling them aside, I shined my flashlight inside and nearly dropped it. The shed had been transformed into some kind of makeshift living space, sleeping bags on the floor, a camping stove, jugs of water, and worst of all, Polaroid photos tacked to the walls. Dozens of them, all showing different teenagers, some smiling, some looking dazed or scared. I recognized at least 3 kids from missing person cases over the past 2 years, cases that had gone cold. Each photo had a date written on the bottom in neat handwriting, and a single word: collected. My radio crackled with confirmation that backup was 5 minutes out, but then I heard it, a muffled scream from inside. Ashley was in there, and she was still alive. I couldn't wait. Using my shoulder, I slammed into the door repeatedly until the old wood began to splinter around the lock. The door finally gave way on my fourth hit, and I burst inside with my weapon drawn. The smell hit me first. Mothballs mixed with something chemical, like chloroform. The main room was exactly as I'd seen through the window, but there was another door at the back, slightly ajar. The humming was louder now, definitely a generator, and I could hear voices. Not just one, but several, speaking in low whispers. I announced myself loudly. "Cedar Rapids Police, anyone in here needs to come out with their hands visible." The whispering stopped immediately, replaced by shuffling sounds and what sounded like furniture being moved. I pushed through the back door and found myself in a narrow hallway with 3 doors. The first 2 were open. One had more sleeping bags and personal belongings, backpacks with names written on them in marker. The third door was locked from the outside with a sliding bolt. Behind it I could hear crying. I slid the bolt back and pulled the door open to find Ashley huddled in the corner of a small room, her wrists zip-tied together, duct tape across her mouth. Her green eyes were wide with terror, but she was conscious and breathing. As I rushed to her, cutting the ties with my pocket knife, she kept pointing frantically behind me, trying to scream through the tape. I spun around just as a man emerged from a hidden panel in the wall I hadn't noticed. Tall, maybe 6'3", wearing maintenance coveralls with Hillcrest embroidered on the pocket. He had this perfectly ordinary face, the kind you'd forget 5 minutes after seeing it, except for his eyes. They were flat, emotionless, like looking at a mannequin. He was holding a syringe in one hand, and in the most casual voice, like we were discussing the weather, he said, "You're early, detective, the others aren't here yet." Before I could respond, he lunged at me with surprising speed. We crashed into the wall, my gun skittering across the floor. His strength was incredible. I outweighed him by at least 30 pounds, but he had me pinned, trying to bring that syringe down toward my neck. Ashley, brave kid that she was, didn't run like I expected. Instead, she grabbed my dropped gun with her shaking hands and screamed, "Get off him!" The man's head snapped toward her, and that split second of distraction was all I needed. I drove my knee up hard into his ribs, heard the air rush out of him, and managed to roll us over. The syringe fell from his grip, rolling under a rusted metal shelf. We grappled on the concrete floor, him clawing at my face while I tried to pin his arms. He kept repeating in that same calm voice, "You don't understand. They need me. They need their guardian." That's when it clicked. This was Guardian 1988 from the chat room. I managed to get my cuffs out, but he was writhing like something possessed. And that's when I heard them. Car doors slamming outside, multiple footsteps approaching fast. But it wasn't my backup. Through the small window, I could see 3 more people in similar maintenance coveralls heading toward the shed. One carrying what looked like a large duffel bag, another holding rope. "Run!" I shouted at Ashley, who was still holding my gun with trembling hands. "Get to the main road and flag down the police cars." She hesitated for a second, then took off through the front room. The man beneath me started laughing, this hollow sound that made my skin prickle. "They won't let her leave," he said. "The cemetery is ours now, has been for 3 years. Every runaway, every forgotten kid, they come to us eventually." I finally got one cuff on his wrist and was reaching for the other when the back door burst open. A woman stood there, probably mid-40s, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing those same coveralls. She was holding a taser. "Let Brother Timothy go," she said, in a voice that sounded like she was talking to a misbehaving child. Behind her, I could see 2 more figures. The situation was spiraling fast. I had 1 suspect half-cuffed, 3 more blocking my exit, and Ashley somewhere outside, hopefully getting to safety. Then I heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Sirens, lots of them, getting closer. The woman's composure cracked for just a moment, her eyes darting toward the door. "Brothers, sisters, we need to go to the tunnels," she commanded, but it was too late. I could hear officers shouting outside, Ashley's voice among them directing them to the shed. The 2 figures behind the woman turned to run, But Timothy grabbed my wrist with his free hand, his fingers like ice. "You don't know what you've done," he hissed. "Those kids needed us. We were saving them from worse things, preparing them for what's coming." The woman dropped the taser and reached into her pocket, pulling out a small glass vial. Before I could react, she smashed it on the ground and thick white smoke began filling the room. My eyes started burning immediately, throat closing up. I managed to drag Timothy toward the door as officers burst in, gas masks already on. They'd come prepared after my radio descriptions. Through my watering eyes, I saw them tackling the woman, saw others chasing down the two who'd tried to flee. Timothy went limp in my grip, playing dead or unconscious, but I kept the cuff on him tight. An officer helped me outside where EMTs were waiting, and there was Ashley, wrapped in a blanket but standing strong, telling another detective everything she'd seen. The aftermath revealed more than anyone in Cedar Rapids wanted to know. The 4 people we arrested that day were part of something they called the Sanctuary, targeting vulnerable teenagers through online chat rooms, convincing them to meet at the cemetery. They'd converted the old maintenance tunnels beneath Hillcrest into a complex of rooms where they held kids for days, sometimes weeks, using drugs to keep them compliant while they prepared them, though for what they never clearly said. We found evidence of at least 12 teenagers who'd been through their hands in the past 3 years. Most had been released after being thoroughly terrorized and drugged, too scared or confused to report what happened. Some were still missing. Timothy, whose real name was Nathan Bowman, had worked as an actual maintenance worker at the cemetery until it closed. The woman, Judith Cray, was a former social worker who'd lost her license in 2018. The other 2 were brothers she'd recruited from her old case files. Ashley testified beautifully at the trial 6 months later. Turned out they'd only had her for about 4 hours before I showed up. Hadn't given her any drugs yet. She's in college now, studying criminal justice, and sends me a Christmas card every year. The cemetery was permanently closed, the tunnels sealed with concrete. But sometimes when I drive past that place, I think about what Timothy said, that they were preparing those kids for something worse. I never did figure out what he meant by that, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. Cemetery work had been my family's trade for 3 generations, and I was the first woman to carry on the tradition after my father retired in 2018. I worked at Willowbrook Memorial just outside of Burlington, Vermont, where my daily routine meant arriving at 4:30 a.m. with my equipment truck to prepare burial plots before the funeral directors showed up around 8. The summer months were particularly brutal if you didn't get an early start. By noon, the heat would make digging nearly impossible, and the humidity would leave you drenched in sweat after just a few minutes of work. 6 years into this job, I'd grown to appreciate the peaceful solitude of those pre-dawn hours, walking between headstones while the rest of the world slept. My grandfather used to tell me that the dead made the best neighbors, and after years of retail work dealing with angry customers, I had to agree with him. I lived alone in a small apartment about 15 minutes from the cemetery grounds. Just me and my tabby cat Winston, who never seemed to mind when I came home covered in dirt and grass stains. That particular morning in early August started like any other, with my headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness as I pulled up to the maintenance gate. The air had that thick, humid quality that promised another scorching day ahead, and crickets were still singing their nighttime symphony. I grabbed my old kerosene lantern from the truck. Yeah, we had flashlights and headlamps, but there was something about that warm, steady glow that I preferred when walking through the older sections of the cemetery. The newer plots had some lighting along the main paths, but the historic section where I needed to work that morning was completely dark, with trees creating a canopy overhead that blocked even the moonlight. I had 3 plots to check and prepare, one for a service at noon, another for the following day, and a third that needed its corners marked for a monument installation. The morning felt particularly still, without even a breeze to rustle the oak leaves, and my footsteps on the gravel path seemed louder than usual in the silence. I'd been walking through the historic section for maybe 10 minutes, my lantern casting long shadows between the weathered headstones, when I noticed another light about 4 rows over to my left. At first, I figured it was just Carl, the other groundskeeper who sometimes came in early, but then I remembered he'd mentioned taking the week off to visit his daughter in Maine. The light moved slowly, deliberately, swaying slightly like someone carrying a lantern at their side. What struck me as odd was the color. While my kerosene lantern gave off that familiar warm orange glow, this other light had a peculiar bluish tint to it, almost like those old gas lamps but somehow colder. I stopped to watch it for a moment, trying to make out who might be there at this hour. The cemetery didn't open to visitors until 7 a.m., and security usually did their rounds in a golf cart with headlights, not on foot with a lantern. The light paused near what I knew was the Garrett family plot, a cluster of graves from the 1890s, with elaborate carved angels on the headstones. I decided to head over and see who it was, probably just someone from the Historical Society doing research, though they usually scheduled their visits and definitely never came this early. As I made my way between the rows, trying not to trip over the older sunken graves where the ground had settled over decades, I kept my eyes on that strange blue light. It seemed to be hovering right at ground level, moving in small circles like someone was examining something closely. The closer I got, the more wrong everything felt. There was this heavy silence that seemed to press against my ears, and even the crickets had stopped their chirping. When I was maybe 20 feet away, close enough that I should have been able to see whoever was holding that light, I called out a friendly, "Morning, can I help you with something?" The instant the words left my mouth, the light simply vanished. Not like someone had switched it off, but like it had never been there at all, leaving my eyes struggling to adjust to the sudden darkness beyond my own lantern's reach. I stood there for a moment, holding my lantern higher to cast more light toward the Garrett plot, telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was some kind of reflection, or one of those phosphorescent fungi that sometimes grew on old wood, though I'd never seen any glow that bright or that blue. As I walked closer to where I'd seen the light, my boot caught on something soft and loose, nearly sending me tumbling forward. When I looked down, my breath caught in my throat. The ground was disturbed, not just disturbed, but freshly turned over with dark, moist soil mounded up like someone had been digging. The grass around the edges was torn up in chunks, and there were deep gouges in the earth, maybe 3 feet long and about a foot wide. I pulled out my work phone to check the schedule, already knowing what I'd find. No burials were planned for this section for at least another month. The Garrett plot had been closed since 1923 when the last family member was interred. The smell hit me then, not the usual earthy scent of freshly turned soil, but something else underneath it, something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. I've been around enough burial sites to know what decomposition smells like, but this was different, older somehow, like opening a room that had been sealed for decades. I knelt down beside the disturbed ground, setting my lantern on a nearby headstone to free up my hands, and that's when I noticed the pattern in the dirt. There were marks that looked almost like claw marks, or maybe someone digging with their bare hands, desperate and frantic. But what really made me stumble backward was what I found partially buried in the loose soil. A piece of fabric, probably wool based on the texture, with buttons that looked handmade from bone or ivory. The fabric was old, really old, the kind of material and craftsmanship you'd see in museums displaying Victorian-era clothing. My mind raced trying to make sense of it all while every instinct screamed at me to get away from that spot. I pulled out my phone to call security, but of course there was no signal in that part of the cemetery. The old trees and the hill blocked most cell reception. I grabbed my lantern and started backing away from the disturbed grave, planning to head to the maintenance shed where we had a landline, when I heard it, a sound like metal scraping against stone, coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, holding my lantern out like a weapon, and saw another section of ground that looked wrong. maybe 30 feet from the first spot. This one was near the Thompson family monument, a tall obelisk from the 1880s, and the earth there was also torn up, but in a different pattern, almost like something had been dragged across it. The scraping sound came again, closer this time, and I could swear I heard something else with it. A rhythmic sound like labored breathing, but deeper, raspier, like air being pulled through wet cloth. My grandfather had told me stories about his years working the cemetery, mostly to scare me when I was a kid, but one thing he'd said suddenly felt very real. Sometimes the old ones don't rest as quiet as they should. I started moving faster toward the main path, not quite running, but definitely not taking my time either, when my lantern's flame began to flicker and dim. I'd filled it that morning, checked the wick like I always did, but the flame was shrinking, turning from its normal orange to that same cold blue I'd seen in the other light. The temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath misting in the air, which made no sense in August even at 5 a.m. That's when I saw them, footprints in the dew-covered grass, appearing one by one like someone invisible was walking beside me, keeping pace. They weren't normal footprints either. They were too long, too narrow, with what looked like an extra joint in the middle of the foot. The breathing sound was right next to my ear now, and I could smell that sweet, rotting smell getting stronger. I gave up on dignity and ran, sprinting toward the maintenance shed while clutching my dying lantern, hearing those wet, rasping breaths keeping up with me no matter how fast I moved. The maintenance shed was only about 200 yards away, but it felt like miles as I crashed through the cemetery, dodging headstones and jumping over low chain barriers between plots. My lantern went completely out halfway there, plunging me into darkness except for the faint pre-dawn glow starting to appear on the eastern horizon. Behind me, I could hear more than just breathing now. There was a dragging sound, like heavy fabric or maybe something worse being pulled across the ground, and underneath it all, a low humming that didn't sound quite human. The shed's outline finally came into view, and I fumbled for my keys while still running, grateful for once that I'd developed the habit of keeping them clipped to my belt loop. I slammed into the door, hands trembling as I tried to get the key into the lock, and that's when I felt it. Cold fingers, impossibly thin and long, brushing against the back of my neck, leaving a trail of something wet and gritty like grave dirt mixed with something else. The lock finally turned, and I practically fell through the doorway, slamming it shut behind me and throwing the deadbolt. Inside the shed, I scrambled for the light switch, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The fluorescent lights flickered on, harsh and normal and beautiful in their ordinary brightness. I grabbed the landline phone on the desk and called Tom, our head of security, trying to keep my voice steady as I told him someone had been vandalizing graves in the historic section. I didn't mention the lights or the footprints or the fingers that had touched my neck. How could I? While I waited for security to arrive, I looked out the small window facing the cemetery. The sun was starting to rise properly now, painting the headstones in soft pink and gold, and everything looked peaceful, normal, like nothing had happened at all. But then I noticed something that made my whole body go rigid. There were muddy handprints on the outside of the window, long and thin with too many joints, and they were fresh, still dripping. Whatever had followed me had stood right there, watching me through the glass while I made my call. Tom arrived about 10 minutes later with another security guard, and I led them back to the historic section, my legs still shaky from the adrenaline. In the full morning light, the disturbed graves were clearly visible, and Tom immediately called the police, treating it as vandalism and possible grave robbing. The cops came, took photos, wrote reports, and everyone seemed to accept the explanation that someone had been trying to steal historical artifacts from the old graves. It happens more often than people think, unfortunately. But I knew what they didn't. The fabric I'd found earlier was gone, dissolved or disappeared somehow, leaving only regular dirt behind. The strange footprints in the grass had vanished with the morning dew, and those handprints on the window had dried to nothing but regular mud smears that could have been anything. The police found no evidence of anyone entering or leaving the cemetery grounds, No cut fences, no tire tracks, nothing. They chalked it up to someone who knew the grounds well, maybe an inside job, and said they'd increase patrols for a while. I finished my shift that day because I needed the money and honestly didn't know what else to do with myself. But I never worked alone in the pre-dawn hours again. I switched to the afternoon shift, taking a pay cut but keeping my sanity. The disturbed graves were restored, resodded, and looked perfectly normal within a week, like nothing had ever happened. I did some research on my own time, diving into the cemetery's old records, and found something that still gives me chills. In 1924, there were reports of similar incidents: mysterious lights, disturbed graves in the historic section, and a groundskeeper who claimed someone was digging themselves out from the inside. That groundskeeper quit suddenly and left town, according to the records. The incident stopped after they installed new iron fencing around the historic section and had a priest bless the grounds. That blessing was supposed to be renewed every 50 years. I checked the dates. The last one had been in 1974, making it exactly 50 years when I had my encounter. I told the cemetery board about the blessing tradition, framing it as a historical preservation issue, and they agreed to have it done again, thinking it would be good publicity. Since then, there haven't been any more incidents, and I still work at Willowbrook, just never alone when it's dark. Sometimes on foggy mornings, I think I see a blue light between the headstones, but I've learned not to look too closely. The call came in around 3 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon in late September. I'd been with the local police department for about 12 years at that point, mostly handling routine stuff in our small Colorado town: domestic disputes, drunk and disorderly conduct, the occasional shoplifter at the grocery store. Officer Sullivan, that's me, though most folks just called me Sully. I was finishing up some paperwork at the station when dispatch radioed about vandalism at Pinewood Cemetery on the east side of town. The groundskeeper, an older guy named Harold, who'd been maintaining those grounds since before I was born, had noticed spray paint on several headstones and what looked like forced entry marks on the old Whitmore family mausoleum. I grabbed my jacket and headed out, figuring it was probably just teenagers being stupid again. We'd had problems with kids drinking in the cemetery during summer break, leaving beer cans everywhere and occasionally knocking over the smaller headstones. The cemetery sat on about 15 acres of rolling hills, dotted with oak trees that were just starting to turn gold and red. I parked my cruiser near the main entrance and spotted Harold waiting for me by the maintenance shed, his weathered face creased with worry. He led me through the older section of the cemetery, past graves dating back to the 1890s, their stones worn smooth by decades of rain and snow. The Whitmore Mausoleum stood near the back corner, a limestone structure about the size of a small garage, with heavy iron doors and stained glass windows depicting angels. Built in 1923, according to the cornerstone. Harold pointed out the damage. Someone had clearly been working at the lock with tools, leaving scratches and gouges in the metal. But what caught my attention immediately were the footprints in the damp earth leading right up to the doors. Fresh prints, couldn't have been more than a few hours old based on how crisp the edges were. The strange part was that they only went in one direction, toward the mausoleum, not away from it. Harold handed me a large brass key from his ring, explaining that each mausoleum had a master key kept in the maintenance office for emergencies or when families requested access. The Whitmores hadn't visited in years. The last family member buried there was Eleanor Whitmore in 1987, and her children had all moved out of state. As I approached the doors, I noticed something else peculiar. The grass around the entrance was worn down in a subtle path, like someone had been coming and going regularly, but carefully enough not to make it obvious. There were also small scratches at about shoulder height on the door frame, fresh ones overlapping older marks that had started to rust. I put on my gloves and inserted the key, feeling resistance at first. The lock mechanism was stiff, probably from lack of use, but after some effort it clicked open. The metal hinges groaned as I pulled the heavy door open, and the smell hit me immediately. Not the musty, abandoned smell you'd expect, but something else. Body odor, food, and underneath it all, the sharp tang of urine. I clicked on my flashlight even though some afternoon light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting red and blue patterns across the stone floor. The mausoleum's interior was about 12 by 15 feet, with stone shelves along 3 walls holding 6 caskets, all sealed and covered in dust. But the floor told a different story. In the far corner, someone had set up what looked like a makeshift living space. A sleeping bag was spread out on a foam camping pad, with a battery-powered lantern sitting beside it. Empty food containers were stacked neatly against the wall: canned soup, crackers, energy bars, bottles of water. A small pile of clothing sat folded on top of a plastic storage container. But what made my pulse quicken was the notebook lying open on the sleeping bag, pages covered in tight, cramped handwriting. Next to it sat a pair of binoculars and what looked like a small digital camera. I stepped closer, careful not to disturb anything, and read the first visible entry in the notebook. It was dated 3 days ago. The woman in the blue coat came again today. 3rd time this week. She always brings roses to plot 47B. Stays exactly 23 minutes. I radioed for backup and started documenting everything with my phone camera while waiting. Flipping through the notebook with my pen, I found pages and pages of observations dating back 4 months. Every entry meticulously recorded visitors to the cemetery, what they wore, which graves they visited, how long they stayed, what they brought, even snippets of conversations the person had apparently overheard. Man with the prosthetic leg visits his son every Monday at 2 p.m. Always talks about the football scores. Another entry. Young couple at the infant section. She cried for 40 minutes today. He held her the whole time. The level of detail was unsettling. This person knew the morning routines of dozens of people, had studied their grief like some kind of twisted research project. Some entries had stars next to them, and these were even more detailed, including physical descriptions, car license plates, and speculation about their jobs and home lives based on their clothing and conversations. One starred entry from 2 weeks ago made me pause. The red-headed woman who visits grave 12C drives a silver Camry. License plate starts with 7G4. Wedding ring tan line but no ring. Always parks in the same spot. Lives alone. Mentioned it to her dead mother today. The camera's memory card was nearly full when I checked it. Hundreds of photos, all taken from various hiding spots around the cemetery. Some were shot from behind trees, others from inside the mausoleum looking out through the stained glass windows. The quality wasn't great, but faces were clearly visible. There were photos of people crying, hugging, talking to headstones, leaving flowers. Private moments of grief captured without permission. In one series of photos, I recognized Mrs. Caldwell, who visited her husband's grave every Sunday after church. The photos showed her from multiple angles, zoomed in on her face as she prayed. Another set showed a young man I didn't recognize, sitting against a headstone with his head in his hands. The timestamp showed these were taken just yesterday evening. Going deeper into the storage container, I found more disturbing items. A cemetery map with certain graves circled in red ink, a maintenance schedule clearly stolen from Harold's office, and several car keys on unmarked rings. At the bottom was a yellowed employee ID badge for the cemetery dated 2008, with a photo of a thin man with hollow cheeks. The name read, Leonard Briggs, groundskeeping assistant. Harold's face went pale when I showed him the ID badge outside the mausoleum. He remembered Leonard, a quiet, strange man who'd worked at the cemetery for about 2 years before being fired in 2010 for inappropriate behavior. Apparently, Leonard had been caught multiple times lingering near funeral services, standing too close to grieving families, trying to comfort strangers in ways that made them uncomfortable. The final straw came when a family complained that he'd followed them to their car, insisting on telling them details about their deceased father that he couldn't have known unless he'd been eavesdropping on their private conversations at the graveside. Harold had to call the police that day to escort Leonard off the property. After that, Leonard had seemingly disappeared from town. Harold mentioned that Leonard had always been obsessed with the old mausoleums, especially the abandoned ones, always asking about their history and which families still visited. He'd even volunteered to clean them on his own time, which Harold had found odd but harmless back then. By the time my backup arrived, Officers Kowalski and Ramirez, I'd found something even more disturbing tucked inside the sleeping bag. It was a second journal, older and more worn, filled with what I can only describe as practice conversations, page after page of imagined dialogues with grieving visitors, responses Leonard had apparently rehearsed for when he would approach them. If she mentions her daughter died of cancer, I understand that pain. My sister went the same way. The chemo was harder than the disease, wasn't it? Another. For military deaths. Thank you for your family's sacrifice. I lost my brother in Afghanistan. Which unit was he in? None of it was true. I later confirmed Leonard had no siblings, no military connections. He'd been creating false personas to connect with mourners, studying their grief to find the perfect way to insert himself into their most vulnerable moments. The last entry was from yesterday. Tomorrow I'll talk to the redhead at 12C. I've waited long enough. She needs someone who understands. I'll mention my wife's death. The car accident story. She'll relate to sudden loss. We immediately put out a bolo for Leonard Briggs and started contacting the people mentioned in his journals. The red-headed woman, Jennifer Huang, was our first priority since she was clearly his next target. When I reached her by phone, she confirmed she'd noticed a thin man watching her from a distance during recent visits, but assumed he was just another mourner. She mentioned something that made my gut twist. Her car had been having issues lately, the engine randomly dying at stoplights. She'd been planning to take it to a mechanic but hadn't gotten around to it yet. I told her to stop driving it immediately and had Officer Ramirez go check it out. Sure enough, he found evidence of tampering with the fuel line, something that would cause intermittent stalling, but not complete failure. Leonard had been setting up a scenario where he could approach her as a helpful stranger when her car broke down in the cemetery's isolated parking area. The mechanical knowledge required suggested this wasn't his first time creating such situations. As the afternoon turned to evening, we discovered the full extent of Leonard's activities. The stolen car keys matched vehicles of regular cemetery visitors. We found 3 cars in the parking lot with GPS trackers hidden underneath, devices you could buy online for $50 each. He'd been monitoring their movements, knowing where they lived, where they worked, when they'd return to the cemetery. In his storage container, we found printed MapQuest directions to 16 different addresses, all belonging to people mentioned in his journals. Some had notes like usually alone on weekends or no security system visible. Mrs. Caldwell nearly collapsed when we told her. She'd been finding small items moved in her garden lately. Her gate left slightly open when she was sure she'd closed it. Another woman, Diane Brewster, mentioned that someone had left flowers on her doorstep twice in the past month with unsigned sympathy cards, even though her husband had passed away 2 years ago. She'd thought it was a kind neighbor, but the handwriting matched Leonard's journals perfectly. The search intensified as darkness fell. We had units checking motels, abandoned buildings, and even other cemeteries in nearby towns. Around 9 p.m., I was back at the station going through Leonard's first journal more carefully when I noticed something. Between 2 pages, pressed flat like a bookmark, was a receipt from a 24-hour laundromat on Madison Avenue, dated just that morning at 4:47 a.m. I knew that laundromat. It had a few efficiency apartments above it, the kind you could rent week to week with no questions asked. I drove over with Officer Kowalski, and the manager confirmed a man matching Leonard's description had rented Unit 3B 6 months ago under the name Larry Brennan, paying cash monthly. The manager led us upstairs, and the smell coming from under the door was unmistakable. The same mix of unwashed clothes and spoiled food we'd encountered in the mausoleum. The manager unlocked it after we showed our warrant, and what we found inside stopped us cold. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with printed photos from the cemetery. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, arranged in clusters around specific graves. Each cluster had a timeline underneath showing visit patterns, quotes from overheard conversations, and personal details Leonard had gathered or guessed at. In the center of the room sat Leonard Briggs, thin to the point of being skeletal, calmly eating from a can of cold beans. He looked up at us without surprise, as if he'd been expecting company. "I knew you'd come eventually," he said in a voice rough from disuse. Harold always was too nosy for his own good. He didn't resist when we cuffed him, just kept talking in this matter-of-fact tone about how he was helping people, how they needed someone who truly understood loss. The strangest part was his absolute conviction that he'd done nothing wrong. As we let him out, he asked if someone could water the flowers he'd planted. Apparently, he'd been secretly tending to neglected graves at night, planting perennials around headstones whose families had stopped visiting. In his twisted mind, he was the cemetery's guardian angel, protecting and comforting the grieving while they were at their most vulnerable. During booking, we found a flash drive in his pocket containing spreadsheets with detailed information on over 200 cemetery visitors, including their routines, relationships, and what he called intervention opportunities, moments when he planned to approach them with his fabricated stories of shared grief. Leonard got 15 years, stalking, criminal harassment, breaking and entering, theft, and attempted kidnapping for what he'd planned with Jennifer Huang's car. The judge called it one of the most extensive stalking cases she'd ever seen. During the trial, it came out that Leonard had lost his own mother when he was young and had been raised by an aunt who wouldn't let him attend the funeral or visit the grave. He'd developed this obsession with cemeteries and grief, spending decades studying how people mourn, convincing himself he could provide the comfort he'd never received. The prosecution's psychiatrist testified that Leonard showed signs of delusional disorder, genuinely believing he was performing a public service. Even in court, he tried to address some of his victims directly, telling them he knew exactly which days were hardest for them, and offering condolences with details that proved he'd been watching them for months. Several people had to leave the courtroom when he started reciting personal conversations they'd had at grave sites, words they thought only the dead had heard. The cemetery installed security cameras after that, and Harold retired early, saying he couldn't walk those grounds anymore without wondering what else he'd missed over the years. Some families moved their loved ones to other cemeteries, unable to shake the feeling of being watched even after Leonard was locked up. Jennifer Huang still visits her mother's grave, but never alone anymore, always bringing her sister or a friend. She told me once that the worst part wasn't the fear, but the contamination of her grief. Those private moments with her mother had been transformed into someone else's entertainment, her pain cataloged and analyzed like data points in Leonard's sick project. As for me, I still patrol that cemetery sometimes, especially in the early morning or late evening when it's quiet. I check the mausoleums, look for signs of disturbance, and wonder how many other Leonard Briggs might be out there, hidden in plain sight, feeding on sorrow like vampires of grief. The Whitmore Mausoleum was cleaned and resealed, but I know Harold's replacement keeps those locks well oiled now, checking them weekly, just in case. I need everyone here to understand that what I'm about to share destroyed my passion for urban exploration. 2 months ago, in early July, I was 24 and running a small YouTube channel where I'd document abandoned places around Michigan. Nothing huge, maybe 3,000 subscribers, but it was my escape from my day job at a warehouse. I lived alone in a studio apartment near downtown Detroit, spent most weekends driving to forgotten buildings with my camera gear. My life was simple. Work, edit videos, scout new locations, repeat. I thought I was brave, thought I'd seen everything these dead places could show me. God, I was such an idiot. The cemetery sat about 40 minutes outside the city, surrounded by thick woods that had started reclaiming the property decades ago. I'd gotten a tip from another explorer on Instagram. Apparently the place had been abandoned since the late 70s when the church that owned it went bankrupt. The iron gates hung crooked on rusted hinges, and weeds had pushed through every crack in the asphalt path leading inside. I parked my beat-up Ford Ranger on a dirt road nearby and grabbed my equipment: Canon DSLR, backup GoPro, flashlight, and the stupid confidence that nothing could surprise me anymore. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, creating these long shadows that stretched across the overgrown grass. Perfect lighting for dramatic shots, I remember thinking. The first thing that struck me was how quiet everything was. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my footsteps crushing dead leaves. Most of the headstones were still standing, though crooked and covered in moss so thick you couldn't read the names anymore. I started filming right away, doing my usual intro about the history of the place while walking backwards through the main path. The cemetery wasn't huge, maybe 200 graves total, arranged in rough rows that had lost their symmetry over the years. Tree roots had pushed up through the ground, creating these weird mounds and valleys between the graves. I kept the camera rolling, narrating what I saw. A child's grave with a lamb carved on top, now missing its head. A massive oak tree that had grown straight through someone's plot, splitting the headstone in half. Standard stuff for my channel, honestly. But then I reached the northeast corner, and that's when everything changed. There, piled against the cemetery's crumbling brick wall, were at least 15 headstones stacked on top of each other like someone had been building a fort. Not fallen naturally, not pushed by tree roots, deliberately placed. The stones at the bottom were huge, probably weighed 200 pounds each, and they formed a kind of foundation. Smaller ones balanced on top, and the whole thing stood about 6 feet tall. Moss and vines had grown over parts of it, but you could tell this arrangement wasn't ancient. Some of the breaks in the stones looked fresh, white granite showing through where they'd been snapped. I circled the pile slowly, keeping my camera trained on it, trying to understand what I was seeing. Who would do this? Why? The space where these headstones had been taken from was visible. A whole section of the cemetery had been stripped bare, just rectangular depressions in the earth where graves should have been marked. I spent maybe 20 minutes filming that pile from every angle, even climbing on a nearby fallen tree to get an overhead shot. The way the stones were arranged reminded me of something, but I couldn't place it, almost like an altar, or maybe a marker itself. Behind the pile, the brick wall had this weird discoloration, a dark stain that spread outward in an almost perfect circle, about 3 feet in diameter. I touched it with my finger and it came away dry and powdery, like old ash. The smell hit me then, this burnt metal scent that made me step back. I kept filming, zooming in on the stain, on the way certain stones had symbols carved into them that didn't match typical cemetery decorations. One had these interconnected circles. Another had what looked like branches but arranged in patterns that hurt to follow with your eyes. The sun was getting lower, maybe an hour before sunset, and I knew I should leave soon. But I wanted to check out the bare section where the headstones had been taken from. I walked over, still recording, and noticed something that made me stop dead. The depressions weren't random, they formed a pattern. From ground level it was hard to see, but there was definitely a design to which graves had been robbed. I pulled out my phone to get some aerial footage with my drone app, but the phone died instantly. Full battery to black screen, just like that. My camera was still working though, so I kept filming. That's when I noticed the ground in the center of the bare section was different. Darker, more compact, like something heavy had been there recently. Boot prints, lots of them, pressed deep into the soil. Fresh ones too. The edges were still sharp, not weathered by rain. I decided to get one last shot of the headstone pile before leaving. The light was perfect now, that golden hour glow that makes everything look cinematic. I positioned myself about 10 feet away, adjusting the camera settings for the lower light. Through the viewfinder, the pile looked even more deliberate, almost sculptural. I started talking to the camera, explaining what I was seeing, theories about why someone would do this. Grave robbers maybe, or local kids trying to be edgy. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. The effort required to move those stones, the specific pattern, the fresh activity. This was something else. I did a slow pan from the pile to the bare section, then back again, trying to capture the whole scene. The camera's autofocus kept hunting, struggling with something I couldn't see. I figured it was just the changing light. I left as the sun touched the horizon, practically jogging back to my truck. The walk that had taken 15 minutes on the way in took me maybe 8 on the way out. I didn't run exactly, but I moved with purpose. Something about that place as darkness approached made every instinct scream at me to leave. The camera stayed on the whole time, bouncing against my chest, probably getting garbage footage. I threw my gear in the passenger seat and drove home without even checking what I'd filmed. Usually I'd review footage right there in the truck, plan my edit, but not that day. I just wanted distance between me and that cemetery. The 2-hour drive home felt longer, and I kept checking my mirrors, though I'm not sure what I expected to see. My apartment had never looked so welcoming. Bright, normal, safe. It wasn't until the next morning after coffee and a shower that I finally sat down to review the footage. I loaded everything onto my computer, opened Premiere Pro, and started scrubbing through the timeline. The early stuff was fine. My intro, the walk through the cemetery, all normal. The footage of the headstone pile was genuinely creepy, perfect for my channel. But when I got to the part where I was filming the pile during golden hour, doing my piece to camera, I saw it. Behind me, maybe 15 feet back, standing between 2 intact headstones, was a figure. Dark, tall, completely still. The quality wasn't great because of the lighting, but it was definitely human-shaped. The thing is, I was alone. I know I was alone. I would have heard someone, seen movement, something. But there it was, just standing there, and here's what really messed me up. It wasn't facing the camera. It was facing away, looking at that bare section where the headstones had been removed. I played that section over and over, frame by frame. The figure never moved, never shifted, just stood there with its back to me for the entire 3 minutes I was filming. The shape was wrong somehow, too tall, maybe 7 feet, and the proportions were weird. The shoulders too broad, the arms too long, hanging past where knees should be. When I zoomed in, the image got grainy, but I could make out what might have been clothing. Or maybe not clothing. The texture was strange, almost like tree bark or rough leather. No visible hair, no distinguishing features, just this dark shape that shouldn't have been there. I exported a still frame, adjusted the brightness and contrast, tried every filter I knew. The more I enhanced it, the less human it looked. There was something around its feet too, like the grass was dead in a perfect circle where it stood. I went back through all the footage, every single second looking for that thing. It wasn't in any of the earlier shots, nothing when I first arrived, nothing when I was examining the headstone pile initially. But then I found it again. In the footage where my camera was bouncing against my chest as I left, there were glimpses of it, multiple glimpses. It was following me, staying exactly 15 feet behind, matching my pace perfectly. When I sped up, it sped up. When I slowed to navigate around a fallen branch, it slowed. Always that same distance, always just at the edge of the frame. The last shot I have of it is at the cemetery gates. It's standing just inside, still and dark as I passed through. After that, nothing. But here's what keeps me awake at night. In that final frame, for just a split second as the camera swung past, it wasn't alone. There were others, maybe 4 or 5 similar shapes, standing among the headstones, all facing the parking area where my truck was. I never posted that video, deleted everything, formatted the memory cards, even considered throwing the camera away. For weeks, I couldn't sleep properly, kept seeing that figure in my peripheral vision. I stopped making videos altogether, let my channel die, ignored messages from subscribers asking where I went. Eventually, I moved to a different apartment, changed jobs, tried to forget. But sometimes I still dream about that cemetery, about those deliberately stacked headstones, about what they might have been marking or containing. I dream about that bare section of ground, and wonder if those graves were emptied from below or from above. Mostly, though, I dream about driving back there and finding my own headstone added to that pile, fresh white granite with my name clearly visible. I wake up from those dreams gasping, and I know with absolute certainty that those things are still there, still watching, still waiting for someone else to discover them. The night shift at the medical supply warehouse ended at 11 p.m., and instead of heading straight home like usual, I turned my Ford Ranger toward Moonridge Memorial Park on the outskirts of Phoenix. My grandmother Rose had been buried there 6 months earlier, and missing my regular Saturday visit was eating away at me. My supervisor had dumped an extra weekend shift on me last minute, claiming someone called in sick. Grandma practically raised me after my parents died when I was 7, taught me everything from how to balance a checkbook to how to make her famous green chili stew. Every week since her funeral, I'd been bringing yellow roses to her grave, the same kind she grew in clay pots on her tiny apartment balcony. That Friday in June 2017, the guilt of potentially missing our weekly appointment pushed me to make the drive despite the late hour. The cemetery gates stayed open until midnight, and I figured 20 minutes would be enough time to leave the flowers and tell her about my week. Moonridge Memorial Park sat where the city gave way to desert, surrounded by a crumbling stone wall that looked older than half the graves inside. I parked near the entrance under the only working security light. The other two had been broken for months, according to the maintenance guy I'd chatted with during previous visits. The bouquet of yellow roses I'd grabbed from the all-night grocery store lay on the passenger seat, wrapped in that crinkly cellophane that sounds too loud in quiet places. The temperature had finally dropped from the day's 105 degrees to something bearable, maybe 75, and a slight breeze carried the smell of creosote bushes from the desert. My phone showed 11:08 p.m. as I grabbed the flowers and headed through the gates. The gravel path crunched under my work boots, and past the first row of headstones, the darkness pressed in from all sides. Section K, where Grandma rested, was a good 5-minute walk toward the back, near a gnarled mesquite tree that somehow pulled enough water from the ground to stay alive. I'd made this walk dozens of times in daylight, could probably navigate it with my eyes closed, but everything shifts in the dark. Headstones that looked welcoming under the sun became gray teeth jutting from the earth, and the decorative angels on the older monuments threw strange shadows that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. The newer sections had flat markers flush with the ground, easier for the lawnmowers, the groundskeeper once told me. But Section K still had the old-style upright stones from the 80s and 90s. Grandma's was simple, just her name, Rose Evelyn Hartley, the dates and beloved mother and grandmother carved in plain letters. Someone had left a small American flag from Memorial Day that had faded in the desert sun. As I knelt to place the roses in the permanent vase attached to the stone, I started talking to her like always, telling her about the new guy at work who kept stealing lunches from the break room fridge, about how my neighbor's cat had kittens last week. The words came out in whispers, partly out of respect for the dead, partly because speaking at normal volume felt wrong in all that stillness. That's when I heard it the first time. My name carried on the breeze, so faint I almost convinced myself it was just the wind through the mesquite branches. Amanda, it seemed to say, drawn out like someone calling from very far away. I stood up, scanning the darkness beyond my phone's flashlight beam. The cemetery stretched out in all directions, row after row of stones barely visible in the dim moonlight. Nobody else would be here this late, I reasoned, especially not on a Friday night when normal people were out at bars or home watching Netflix. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, coming from somewhere off to my left where the older sections bordered a dried-up wash. Amanda. Not urgent or threatening, just calling. My rational brain tried to explain it away. Maybe teenagers hanging out, drinking beer among the headstones like kids sometimes did. Except teenagers would be louder, laughing, making noise. This voice had a quality that made the hair on my arms stand up, like hearing a song played in a minor key when you expected major. I decided to finish up quickly and leave. Grandma would understand. She'd always been practical, never one for unnecessary risks. I touched the cold granite of her headstone, whispered a quick goodbye, and turned back toward the path. The flashlight on my phone carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, and I kept it aimed straight ahead, refusing to look at the shadows pressing in from both sides. My work boots seemed impossibly loud on the gravel, each step echoing between the monuments. About halfway back to the entrance, near a section where they'd recently installed a new row of black marble headstones that reflected my flashlight like dark mirrors, I heard my name again. This time from the right, from behind a cluster of old family crypts built into a small hill. Amanda. Then before I could process it, another voice from somewhere behind me. Amanda. Different pitch, different tone, like two distinct people were calling me. My pace quickened without conscious thought, that primitive part of the brain that knows when to run taking over. The voices multiplied as I walked faster. They came from between the headstones, from behind the larger monuments, from the patches of ornamental juniper bushes the cemetery used to mark section boundaries. Amanda, Amanda, Amanda. Some whispered, some spoke in normal tones, some sounded almost like singing. Male voices, female voices, and some I couldn't identify as either. They weren't getting louder exactly, but there were more of them, overlapping like a twisted chorus. None of them sounded angry or aggressive. If anything, they sounded curious, almost welcoming, which somehow made it worse. My phone battery was at 12%, I noticed with a spike of panic. The entrance gate was still maybe 300 yards away, the security light a small beacon in the distance. I broke into a jog, no longer caring about being respectful to the dead. The roses I'd brought for Grandma flashed through my mind. I'd left the cellophane wrapper on the ground by her grave, littering in a cemetery. The thought was absurd given the situation, but the brain does weird things when it's terrified. Then I saw movement. Not dramatic or obvious, but subtle shifts in my peripheral vision. Between the headstones, shapes that weren't quite shadows and weren't quite light seemed to drift from stone to stone. They moved wrong, too fluid like smoke given form, but not following the laws of physics smoke should follow. When I turned my flashlight toward them, nothing was there except granite and marble and the occasional plastic flowers left by mourners. But the moment the light moved away, the movement resumed. The voices grew more insistent, and now I could make out words beyond just my name. "Stay," one said, clear as if someone stood next to me. "Remember us?" came from near a tall obelisk monument. "Lonely," whispered from somewhere low, maybe from one of those flat markers I'd been walking over. My jog turned into a run. Sweat ran down my back despite the cool air, and my breathing came in ragged gasps that seemed too loud, like I was broadcasting my location to whatever was following me. Because something was definitely following me now. I could hear footsteps on the gravel behind me, matching my pace perfectly. Except when I risked a glance backward, the beam of my dying phone showed nothing but empty path stretching into darkness. The footsteps continued, though, steady and deliberate, maybe 20 feet behind me. The voices had organized themselves into something almost like a conversation, talking to each other about me as if I wasn't there running for my life. "She's young. She remembers. Like the others who come at night. But she can hear." That last phrase repeated from multiple voices, spreading through the cemetery like gossip at a church social. My Ford Ranger was visible now, parked under that security light, maybe 50 yards away. The iron gates stood open, and beyond them, the normal world of streetlights and distant traffic waited. But between me and escape, the air itself seemed to thicken. The temperature dropped at least 15 degrees in the span of 3 steps, and my breath came out in visible puffs. The voices crescendoed, no longer whispers but full-throated calls. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all saying my name in unison. The sound pressed against my eardrums, not painful but overwhelming. like being underwater in a pool where everyone above is shouting. My phone died completely just as I reached the last row of graves before the parking area. The sudden darkness nearly made me trip over a low border fence made of decorative chain, but muscle memory and adrenaline kept me moving. In that complete blackness, with only the distant security light to guide me, the cemetery transformed into something else entirely. The air sparkled with tiny points of light, like fireflies but wrong. They pulsed in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost like Morse code or heartbeats. Each grave I passed seemed to exhale a cold breath, and I swear I felt fingers brush against my jacket, my hair, the back of my neck. Not grabbing or violent, more like blind people trying to identify who was rushing past them. The voices had shifted into something between laughing and crying, a sound that human throats shouldn't be able to make. She runs like Margaret did. 60 years since Margaret. The young ones always run. These fragments reached my ears clearly despite my ragged breathing and pounding footsteps. I burst through the cemetery gates like breaking through the surface of water, gasping and stumbling. The normal sounds of the world rushed back. Distant cars on the highway, a dog barking somewhere in the neighborhood, the electrical hum of the streetlight. I fumbled for my keys with numb fingers, dropped them once on the asphalt, grabbed them, and practically threw myself into the truck. The engine turned over on the third try. It always needed coaxing when the temperature changed quickly, and I reversed out of that parking spot so fast I nearly clipped the stone pillar by the entrance. In my rearview mirror, just for a second before I turned onto the main road, I saw them. Hundreds of pale, translucent figures standing just inside the cemetery gates, packed together like commuters waiting for a train. They weren't looking at me. They were looking at each other, moving their mouths in conversation I could no longer hear. Some wore modern clothes, others dressed in styles from decades past. A few children stood among them, no taller than the adults' waists. One woman in what looked like a 1950s sundress raised her hand in what might have been a wave. Then I turned the corner and they were gone, just the cemetery gates and darkness in my mirror. I drove home on autopilot, gripping the steering wheel hard enough to leave marks on my palms. My apartment complex never looked so welcoming. Ordinary, boring, beautifully normal with its identical beige buildings and neatly trimmed hedges. Inside, I turned on every light, made coffee I didn't drink, and sat on my couch until dawn trying to make sense of what happened. I called in sick the next day and the day after that. On Monday, I finally went back to work, but took a different route that didn't pass anywhere near Moonridge Memorial Park. I researched the cemetery online, finding nothing unusual in its history. No mass graves, no scandals, no ghost stories. Just a normal cemetery that had been there since 1963. But I did find an old newspaper archive from 1964 about a woman named Margaret Fielding, who disappeared after visiting her husband's grave at night. Her car was found in the cemetery parking lot, engine still running, but she was never seen again. The article mentioned she'd told her sister she heard voices calling her name whenever she visited after dark, but everyone assumed grief was making her imagine things. I never went back to visit Grandma Rose at night. For 3 weeks I couldn't bring myself to go at all, but the guilt eventually won. Now I only visit on Saturday mornings when the sun is high and other people are around, and I never stay past noon. I switched to artificial flowers. They last longer, and I don't have to visit as often. Sometimes other visitors mention hearing things at night, always in that casual way people bring up experiences they're not sure really happened. The groundskeeper, an older man named Frank who's worked there for 30 years, once told me the cemetery gets active after dark, but wouldn't elaborate. I still hear those voices sometimes in my dreams, calling my name in that overlapping chorus, inviting me back. The worst part is they don't sound threatening anymore. They sound lonely, like a gathering of people who just want someone new to talk to, someone who can still hear them. I think about Margaret Fielding a lot. Wonder if she finally answered their call. If she's standing there now with the others just inside the gates, waiting for the next person who visits after dark. Grandma Rose always said the dead don't want to hurt us. They just want to be remembered. Maybe she was right, but I'm not brave enough to find out. There was a period during my sophomore year when I spent a lot of nights wandering around town just to clear my head. The campus was small, and after midnight, most streets felt deserted, like the whole place had gone to sleep except me. One evening, I'd heard a couple of upperclassmen joking about strange things happening in the cemetery on the edge of town. They talked about hearing voices, shadows that didn't belong, footsteps that seemed too close. It didn't sound like they were serious, but it stuck with me more than it should have. By the weekend, I'd made up my mind to go see for myself, even though I wasn't exactly the bravest person around. That night was damp from a light rain earlier, the kind that leaves the ground soft and the air heavy. I slipped out with a flashlight I'd borrowed from my roommate, a cheap black one with scratches on the side that rattled when I shook it. The cemetery gate wasn't even locked, just one of those swinging iron bars with peeling paint. I pushed it open, careful not to let it squeal too loud, and stepped inside. My sneakers sank slightly into the wet gravel, and the smell of wet grass and stone hit me immediately. For a moment, I thought about turning back, but curiosity kept pushing me forward. I walked down the main path, aiming the beam of light at the ground, and then up toward the rows of headstones. They varied in shape and age, some chipped and leaning, others polished smooth like they'd been set in place recently. A few had plastic flowers that looked oddly bright under the flashlight's beam, colors too alive for a place so still. The only sound was the crunch of my own steps and the faint drip of water from tree branches. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Just stones, just names, just silence. Nothing to worry about. Then it happened. Another sound layered itself over mine, subtle at first but distinct. Heavy steps like boots pressing into wet earth. They weren't constant, more like they appeared in rhythm with my own. I slowed and the sound faded. I walked again, and there it was, right behind me. My first thought was that maybe another student had followed me in to mess with me, but when I spun around, flashlight cutting through the dark, there was nothing. Only the main path stretching back to the gate, glistening damp in the pale light. My pulse quickened, and for the first time that night I regretted being there at all. I tried brushing it off, convincing myself it was just the echo of my own steps bouncing weirdly off the stones and trees. Still, every nerve in my body was tuned in to that sound. I moved slower this time, deliberately placing each foot, and yet behind me the weighty tread came back, matching me with uncanny precision. I whipped the flashlight left and right, letting the beam skate over crooked crosses, carved angels with chipped wings, and even the low stone wall at the edge of the grounds. Everything was perfectly still. Too still. The thought of someone hiding among the markers crawled into my mind. I pictured a local messing with me, crouched just beyond the light, waiting for me to panic. My throat went dry as I called out, "Hello?" The word came out thinner than I intended, swallowed almost immediately by the damp air. No answer, no rustle of movement, just the quiet return of water dripping from branches. My own breathing felt too loud, filling the silence in ways I couldn't control. When I forced myself to keep walking, I noticed something new. The soil along the main path glistened, soft and dark from the earlier rain, and there, next to my own prints, were others. Fresh, deep impressions of a shoe with a wide sole. They weren't random. Each one lined up perfectly with my stride, like someone invisible was shadowing every step I took. My flashlight trembled slightly as I angled it closer, following the trail. Wherever I stopped, the last print matched exactly, ending right beside mine as though someone had halted in sync. The air pressed heavier around me, damp and suffocating, and every instinct screamed to leave. Yet my legs locked into this rhythm of moving and checking, moving and checking. Each time I spun around, the steps fell silent, but the evidence was stamped clearly into the ground behind me. It was no echo, no trick. Someone or something was there, pacing me without ever revealing itself. The realization sent a deep shiver crawling up my spine, and for the first time I understood why people told stories about this place in hushed voices. I backed away from the prince, trying to convince myself to leave before my nerves completely gave out. The gate wasn't far. I could see the faint glimmer of the streetlight beyond it, but the path leading out felt impossibly long now, every step dragging as though I were walking through water. Behind me, the weighty thud started again, perfectly timed, pressing into the soil in tandem with mine. My neck prickled like something unseen was leaning close, just out of sight. Halfway down the path, I lost the nerve to play along. I broke into a run, flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the stones. My sneakers slapped against the wet ground, and I swore I heard the answering rhythm right behind me. Heavier, faster, relentless. I didn't dare look back this time. The only thing in my mind was the gate, the thin iron bar standing between me and the open street. I burst through, nearly tripping as I shoved the gate open and stumbled onto the pavement outside. The instant I crossed that line, the sound stopped. Dead silence. My chest heaved, my breath ragged in the cool night air, and I whipped around expecting to see someone barreling out behind me. But the path was empty. The last set of prints ended just inside the cemetery gate, as if whatever had been there couldn't cross over. I didn't stick around to make sense of it. I bolted back toward campus and swore to myself I'd never step foot in that place again. Even now, I can picture those perfect impressions in the soil side by side with mine, vanishing at the boundary like they had rules to follow. I never told anyone the full story, just laughed off the rumors when they came up again. But every time I pass that cemetery, I walk a little faster, ears straining for the sound I hope I'll never hear again. There was a stretch in my teenage years when hanging out after dark felt like the only way to shake the boredom of our small town. A few friends and I had this habit of cutting through the cemetery near the edge of town whenever we wanted to meet up at the gas station on the other side. It shaved at least 15 minutes off the walk, and even though the place carried a heavy silence that made most people uneasy, we thought it was just another shortcut. At that age, the creepiness almost felt like a dare, and none of us wanted to be the first to admit it gave us chills. The night I'm talking about was cool enough that you could see your breath in the air, but not cold enough to keep us inside. I remember Mason had his hoodie pulled tight around his face, and Leah kept complaining that her sneakers were getting damp from the grass. I carried a flashlight, mostly because my mom insisted, though I usually just let it swing at my side. The cemetery was dark except for one flickering light near the entrance, right by the public restroom building that no one ever seemed to use. As we passed by that building, a sound cut through the stillness. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't the wind. It was a pounding, rhythmic and sharp, echoing against the cement walls of the restroom. At first we laughed, thinking it might be some older kids messing with us, but when we got closer, we saw that the door was wrapped with a thick rusted chain. The lock was so corroded it looked fused to the metal. No way anyone had just closed it up that night. The banging didn't stop. If anything, it grew more desperate the longer we stood there. Each hit rattled the door and sent vibrations into the ground, like someone inside was slamming their fists, or maybe even kicking with everything they had. Leah whispered that we should leave, her voice barely carrying above the thudding, but Mason stepped forward as if to challenge whatever was making the noise. I wanted to believe it was a prank, but the sheer force behind those sounds didn't feel like something staged. Mason leaned closer, aiming the beam of my flashlight at the chained door. The paint on the frame was chipped, curling away to expose raw wood underneath, and dust covered the hinges. No footprints, no signs of anyone hanging around recently. Just that relentless pounding from the other side. He muttered something about checking the back, but Leah grabbed his sleeve and told him not to. The thought of circling around that structure while the noise kept hammering was enough to make my chest tighten. We argued for maybe half a minute, standing in that dim halo of light. The sound suddenly stopped, cutting off so abruptly it felt like someone had hit a switch. None of us moved or even breathed for a few seconds, just waiting. Then, 3 sharp strikes slammed against the door. Boom, 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 and the chain jerked hard enough to rattle. I swear the padlock shifted against the metal like it might snap off. That was the moment even Mason's bravado cracked. He pulled back fast, muttering that we needed to go. The walk through the rest of the cemetery felt stretched, like the silence itself was pushing down on us. Every gravel crunch under our sneakers sounded too loud. Leah kept glancing behind us, expecting someone, or something, to be following. When we finally reached the gas station, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead felt almost unreal, like we had crossed into a different world. I remember leaning on the counter, still trying to make sense of what we'd heard. It was the clerk who suggested telling security. The guy knew us, probably thought we were causing trouble, but when he saw Leah's face, he stopped smirking. He picked up the phone and called the security office for the cemetery. About 20 minutes later, a man in a gray uniform showed up, name tag reading Holloway. We stumbled over each other, explaining the banging, the chained door, the way it had nearly burst off its hinges. Holloway listened, then shook his head slowly and said the restroom had been out of service for over a year. The pipes busted, the whole building sealed since then. Holloway must have noticed our disbelief because he offered to show us. We walked back together, his flashlight cutting clean circles through the darkness. By then the cemetery felt different, heavier, like the quiet had thickened since we left. When we reached the restroom building, the chain was still wound tight across the door, the padlock rusted in place. Holloway tugged it once, then stepped back, brushing dust from his gloves. "See?" he said. "No one's been in there for a long time." Leah asked if maybe an animal had gotten trapped inside. Holloway shook his head and explained the windows had been sealed, the vents covered. "No way anything living is in there," he added. The way he said it didn't feel reassuring. It felt like he was reciting something he'd had to say before. Mason pressed his ear to the door, daring the silence to break, but it didn't. The whole place seemed swallowed by stillness. We left without answers, though none of us wanted to admit how shaken we were. Even at the gas station later, trying to joke about it, there was this edge in every laugh. When we parted ways, I kept thinking about those 3 final strikes against the door, how deliberate they had sounded, like whoever or whatever was inside wanted us to remember them. I've walked through that cemetery since then, but I never go near the restroom anymore. People say it's been locked for years, that the plumbing never got fixed, and that no one's allowed inside. Still, I can't forget the force behind those bangs, the chain straining against the door as if it wouldn't hold forever. Maybe it was just some trick of acoustics or nerves, but part of me is convinced something was in there that night, and I don't think I'll ever know what. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Okay, Reddit. I'm finally ready to share what happened in Asheville, Kentucky during the mid-80s. I was 12 years old in 1982. Living with my mom, Beverly, and stepdad, Thomas, in this sleepy coal mining town where nothing ever happened. Thomas worked the night shift at Blackwood Mine, coming home covered in coal dust every morning, while Mom ran the local post office, a job that made her the unofficial town gossip hub. Our house sat on Maple Street, third one from the corner, with a wraparound porch where I'd spend hours reading comic books and watching neighbors tend their gardens. Asheville had maybe 800 people, the kind of place where everyone attended the same church, shopped at the same grocery store, and knew which family had money troubles just by observing who bought generic cereal. Life moved at a snail's pace, and honestly, I thought I'd die of boredom before I ever made it to high school. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in March when Mrs. Hoffman from down the street came running into the post office, waving a white envelope like it was on fire. I was there helping Mom sort mail before school, and I remember how Mrs. Hoffman's usually perfect hair looked wild, her face flushed red from running. She slammed the letter on the counter and demanded to know who had access to the mail, her voice shaking with rage. The envelope had her name written in neat block letters, no return address, and inside was a single sheet of paper that apparently contained information about her husband's gambling debts that had supposedly been wiped clean years ago. What made it worse was that the letter mentioned specific amounts, dates, and even the name of the bookie in Louisville. Mrs. Hoffman swore only 3 people knew those details: herself, her husband, and the bookie. The problem was her husband had been dead for 2 years, and the bookie had moved to Florida. Mom tried to calm her down, but Mrs. Hoffman just kept repeating that someone was watching them all, someone who knew things they shouldn't know. Within a week, 3 more families received similar letters. The Hendersons got one detailing how their teenage son Kyle had been stealing from the church collection plate for months, complete with exact amounts and dates. The Johnsons received a letter about how Mrs. Johnson had been having an affair with the married pharmacist 2 towns over, including details about a specific birthmark on the man's shoulder that only someone who'd seen him undressed would know. But the letter that really sent shockwaves through our community was the one delivered to the Presleys. Their envelope contained information about how Mr. Presley had been skimming money from the volunteer fire department's emergency fund to pay for his daughter's medical treatments. The letter included photocopies of bank statements, forged signatures, and a breakdown of exactly how he'd been moving money around. What terrified everyone was the level of detail. These weren't just rumors or gossip. These were facts that required intimate knowledge of people's private lives, financial records, and personal relationships. The town started to unravel fast. People who had been friends for decades suddenly became suspicious of each other. Mrs. Henderson accused the church secretary of writing the letters since she had access to the collection records. The Johnsons blamed the pharmacist's wife, thinking she'd discovered the affair and was seeking revenge. But the scariest part was how accurate every single detail was. When confronted, Kyle Henderson broke down and confessed to stealing from the church. Mrs. Johnson didn't deny the affair, but swore she'd never told anyone about the birthmark. Mr. Presley eventually admitted to the embezzlement, but insisted he'd covered his tracks so well that even the bank auditors hadn't noticed. The letters weren't just exposing secrets, they were revealing truths that people thought they'd buried forever. Thomas started coming home from work early, checking all our windows and doors before bed. Mom stopped gossiping with customers at the post office, afraid that anything she said might somehow end up in one of those white envelopes. The letters kept coming, always on different days of the week, always hand-delivered to mailboxes during the night. Nobody ever saw who delivered them, despite half the town taking turns keeping watch. Old Mr. Bailey set up a chair by his front window and stayed awake 3 nights straight, but even he never caught sight of the mysterious letter writer. The envelopes were always identical, plain white paper, no watermark, with names written in the same careful block letters using a standard blue ballpoint pen. The police chief, Ed McQuaid, collected several of the letters for analysis. But this was 1982 in rural Kentucky. We didn't have access to sophisticated forensic testing. The only thing he could confirm was that the handwriting appeared to be deliberately disguised, with the writer probably using their non-dominant hand to avoid recognition. What made it even more unsettling was that the letters seemed to target specific people for specific reasons. The recipients weren't random. They were all people who held positions of trust or respect in the community, people whose secrets would cause the most damage when exposed. By summer, the situation had escalated beyond simple gossip and shame. The Riverside family received a letter detailing how their supposedly deceased grandfather had actually abandoned the family 30 years earlier after stealing their neighbor's life savings. The letter included a current address in Oregon, where the grandfather was supposedly living under a false name, along with photos of him working at a hardware store. When the family confronted the neighbor, Mrs. Yates, she broke down crying and admitted she'd never told anyone about the theft because she'd been too ashamed to admit she'd trusted someone with her late husband's insurance money. The revelation destroyed the friendship between the families and split the entire neighborhood into sides. Then came the letter that changed everything. The Nelsons received an envelope containing evidence that their 15-year-old daughter, Chloe, had been secretly dating a married man in his 30s from the next county over. The letter included motel receipts, photographs of them together, and detailed descriptions of their meetings. It was the kind of information that could only come from someone who had been following them, watching them, documenting their every move. Mr. Nelson went into a rage unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. He was a quiet man who worked as a mechanic at the local garage, but when he read that letter, he became someone else entirely. He grabbed his shotgun from the gun cabinet and drove straight to the man's house, demanding justice for what he considered the abuse of his daughter. The confrontation ended with Mr. Nelson shooting the man in the leg before neighbors managed to wrestle the gun away from him. The whole incident could have been much worse, but it marked the point where the letters stopped being just a source of embarrassment and became genuinely dangerous. Mr. Nelson was arrested, the injured man was hospitalized, and Chloe was so traumatized by the exposure and violence that she attempted to hurt herself that same night. The ambulance sirens wailing through our quiet streets at 2 a.m. will haunt me forever. Everyone in town could hear them, and we all knew what had happened. The letters had finally drawn blood, and the mysterious writer had gotten exactly what they seemed to want: complete chaos. The aftermath was devastating. Mr. Nelson was charged with attempted murder and assault with a deadly weapon. Chloe was sent to live with relatives in another state, while she recovered from her suicide attempt. The injured man's wife filed for divorce, and their 3 children had to endure whispers and stares everywhere they went. But the worst part was that the letters didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent and more vicious. The next wave targeted the families of people who had been trying to investigate the mystery. Police Chief McQuaid received a letter detailing how he'd been taking bribes from local businesses to overlook health code violations. The letter included copies of checks, photographs of him accepting envelopes, and testimonies from business owners who admitted they'd been paying him for years. When the state police arrived to investigate, they found evidence exactly where the letter said it would be, hidden in a false bottom of his desk drawer. McQuaid was arrested within hours, leaving our town without effective law enforcement just when we needed it most. The paranoia reached a breaking point when families started receiving letters about each other's attempts to solve the mystery. The Whitman family got a letter revealing that their neighbor, Mr. Torres, had been secretly recording their phone conversations using equipment he'd ordered from a spy catalog. Mr. Torres received a letter exposing how the Whitmans had been going through his trash every night, looking for clues about who might be writing the letters. It was like the mystery writer could see everything, hear everything, and knew exactly how to turn the entire community against itself. People stopped talking to their neighbors, started changing their locks, and began sleeping with weapons by their bedside. The local hardware store sold out of security cameras, deadbolts, and motion sensors within a week. But somehow, the letters kept finding their way into mailboxes, no matter how many precautions people took. The writer seemed to anticipate every security measure and adapt accordingly. Several families tried sleeping in shifts to watch their mailboxes, but they'd wake up to find letters that had been delivered during the few minutes when they'd dozed off. By late 1984, nearly half the town's population had moved away. The local school had to combine several grades because so many families had fled. Businesses closed because there weren't enough customers left, and the remaining residents lived in a state of constant fear and suspicion. The letters had evolved too. They were no longer just exposing old secrets, but began predicting future actions. The Grimm family received a letter warning them that their son would be caught stealing from the grocery store on a specific date and time. Sure enough, When that date arrived, their son was discovered shoplifting exactly as the letter had predicted. The Cooper family was told their teenage daughter would be found drinking alcohol behind the church on a particular Sunday afternoon. She was caught red-handed at the precise time mentioned in the letter. It was as if the writer wasn't just observing the town's secrets but was somehow orchestrating events, manipulating people into fulfilling the predictions. The psychological pressure was unbearable. People started questioning whether they were making their own choices or being controlled by someone who seemed to know their every thought and action. The end came suddenly in March 1987, exactly 5 years after the first letter. I was 15 by then, and my family was among the few who had stayed in Asheville. Thomas had been promoted to mine supervisor, and Mom had become the interim postmaster after her predecessor fled town. We'd received our own letter the previous month, one that detailed how Thomas had been falsifying safety reports at the mine to meet production quotas. The letter was accurate, of course, and Thomas had confessed everything to Mom and the mine owners. He'd been taking shortcuts that could have gotten people killed, all because he was desperate to keep his job and support our family. The confession destroyed something between my parents, a trust that never fully recovered. But that final morning, something changed. Mom was sorting through the mail when she found an envelope addressed to the entire town. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just one line. "The truth has been served. My work here is complete." That was it. No signature, no explanation, just that simple goodbye message. After that day, the letters stopped completely. No more revelations, no more secrets, no more predictions. The mysterious writer vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving behind a town that was forever changed. Some families tried to rebuild their relationships, but the damage was too deep. Others simply accepted that their secrets were now public knowledge and tried to move forward. A few, like the Nelsons, never recovered from the trauma. Over the years, I've wondered if the letter writer was someone who lived among us the whole time, watching our daily lives and taking notes. Or maybe it was someone from outside who had connections throughout the community, a former resident who had kept in touch with the right people. The truth is, we never found out who was behind it all. The letters stopped, the chaos eventually died down, and life slowly returned to something resembling normal. But Asheville was never the same. The population never recovered, most of the businesses never reopened, and the sense of community trust was permanently broken. I moved away for college in 1990 and rarely go back, but when I do, I can still see the lingering effects of those 5 years. People still seem wary of each other, still reluctant to share personal information, still checking their mailboxes with a mixture of hope and dread. Back in the late 90s, I was living in Brookhaven, Nebraska, a quiet, slow-moving town where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. At the time, I worked part-time at a small local hardware store and spent most of my mornings taking care of my Uncle Frank, who'd been staying with me after a hip surgery. He was in his 70s, still sharp, still stubborn, and swore he didn't need help, but deep down, I think he liked the company. Most of our errands were routine. Grocery store runs, post office visits, and a weekly stop at Whitlow's pharmacy to pick up his vitamins and blood pressure meds. That place had been around forever. People trusted it like they trusted their own churches. The first death didn't raise many eyebrows. Mrs. Ellen Wade, a soft-spoken widow who ran the knitting club at the community center, was found in her recliner one morning by her son. No signs of distress, no struggle, just gone. A heart attack, people guessed. She was old, lived alone, and had some medical issues. But then, only a few days later, Mr. Grant Holloway, who'd just seen his grandkids over the weekend, was also found dead in his bed, almost the same way. No pain, no warning. That's when folks started murmuring. 2 healthy seniors just passing in their sleep within the same week? It didn't sit right. Uncle Frank noticed it first. His vitamins tasted different. Not bitter or spoiled exactly, just wrong. He joked about it. Said it reminded him of the stuff he used to clean his fishing gear with. I brushed it off at first, assuming it was just a new brand or a bad batch, until I spotted a tiny burn-like mark on the inside of one of his pill bottles, right where the cap twisted on. It looked like a melted bubble, like the plastic had reacted to something. I thought about tossing the bottle, but something in my gut told me to keep it. Frank started feeling nauseous in the mornings after taking them, and by the fourth day he was pale and weak. We stopped the pills immediately, thinking maybe he'd developed a sensitivity. We didn't realize we were getting dangerously close to something way bigger than a bad batch. I took the bottle back to Whitlow's and asked to speak with someone about it. The guy at the counter, Jeremy, barely looked at it, just said sometimes the heat sealers malfunction, nothing to worry about. But he wouldn't let me keep the bottle, said they'd need it for inventory. I pushed a bit, asked if anyone else had complained. He froze, not obviously, but I caught the flicker. That tiny pause where someone's brain scrambles to come up with the safest lie. That night I checked with some neighbors. Turns out both Ellen and Mr. Holloway had their prescriptions filled at Whitlow's. Same brand of vitamins, same white pill bottle with the yellow sticker. I felt this cold, creeping sense that we'd been inches from something no one was ready to say out loud. The more I dug, the more patterns started forming. Ellen's son mentioned she'd recently increased her vitamin dosage, following advice from someone at the pharmacy. Mr. Holloway's daughter told me he'd switched brands 2 months before. Again, suggested by someone from Whitlow's. All of them had been buying the same specific line of premium senior vitality supplements the pharmacy started carrying that summer. I wasn't trying to play detective at first, I swear, but it felt like nobody else was going to ask these questions. Not the coroner, not the local paper. Everyone was just nodding along like this was all coincidence and bad luck. But people weren't just dropping dead in their sleep by chance. Not here. Not like this. Uncle Frank started getting better after we stopped the pills. He got his color back, started joking again, and insisted on mowing part of the lawn even though he was still limping. I kept that original pill bottle hidden under the sink in a zip bag just in case. A couple weeks later, a local reporter named Dana Bricks showed up at the store. She was chasing rumors about a spike in elderly deaths. I didn't tell her everything, but I mentioned what I'd noticed, and that was enough for her to start sniffing around. It didn't take long before she connected even more dots. Turns out there had been 6 similar deaths since spring, all quiet, all seniors, all from different parts of town but tied together by one thing: Whitlow's pharmacy. Things escalated fast after Dana published the article. At first, it was brushed off like tabloid stuff, but then one of the families demanded an independent toxicology report. What they found was horrifying. Traces of a compound similar to cyanide, but lab-altered, and in such low doses that it would have gone undetected in standard tests. Someone was microdosing poison into those vitamins, enough to shut down an old heart, but subtle enough to mimic natural causes. That's when the cops got involved, and the town's trust started crumbling fast. Whitlow's closed its doors the same day the story broke. The shock came when they arrested Mr. Carlton, the pharmacist. I'd known him since I was a kid. He was the kind of man who remembered birthdays, handed out free lollipops to kids, and sponsored local baseball teams. Everyone liked him. Turns out, beneath the white coat and warm smiles, he was drowning in debt, gambling, bad investments, and rumors of a second family in another state. The insurance policies tied to those seniors, he'd quietly convinced several of them to sign over power of attorney, or had access through family members who trusted him with their elderly parents' meds. It wasn't just sick, it was surgical, cold, calculated. Uncle Frank was one of the lucky ones. I still think about how close he came to being on that list. The investigators asked us for the remaining pills, and when they tested them, the same compound was found. Frank had unknowingly been taking small doses of poison for nearly 2 weeks. The doctors said, if we hadn't stopped when we did, his heart might not have handled it. That knowledge haunted me for months. I kept replaying all those mornings he said he felt weird, or too tired to move. I brushed it off as age. Turns out it was something far darker crawling beneath the surface of our quiet routines. The trial was a circus. Carlton pleaded not guilty at first, but the evidence was airtight. Records showed manipulated inventory logs, tampered batch numbers, and even a personal notebook listing dosages tied to specific client names. That image, pages filled with names of real people, neighbors, friends, lined up like a checklist. I don't think I'll ever forget that. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a kind of evil I didn't think people were capable of. Not in a place like this. Not by someone we all trusted with our lives, quite literally. After all that, Whitlow's never reopened. The building sat boarded up for years until someone finally turned it into a pet grooming place. But no one talks about what it used to be. People in town got quieter, more guarded. It changed how we looked at each other. Frank eventually moved in with my cousin out west. Said he wanted to be closer to grandkids, but I knew part of it was just needing distance from everything that happened. I can't blame him. Every time I pass that corner where the pharmacy used to be, I feel like I'm looking at a stage where something terrible once played out behind a friendly curtain. I still don't understand how someone like Carlton could do what he did and smile through it. That's the part that keeps me up sometimes. Not the poison, not even the deaths, but how easily he lived among us while carrying that secret. He saw us every day, shook our hands, gave advice, and walked back into that little room behind the counter to plan another death. Evil doesn't always look how you think it will. Sometimes it wears a white coat and asks how your weekend was. The whole nightmare started on a rainy Thursday evening in late September 2006. I'm Jason, and at the time I was 28, living in this quiet neighborhood called Magnolia Heights in Oxford, Mississippi. My wife Angela and I had bought our first house there about 3 years earlier, a modest 2-story colonial with a big oak tree in the front yard and a wraparound porch that made us feel like we'd finally made it as adults. I was managing construction projects for a local company. Angela worked at the town library, and we were the kind of couple who actually enjoyed mowing the lawn on weekends and hosting barbecues for our neighbors. Life was predictable in the best possible way. We knew everyone on our street, from old Mr. Vincent who collected vintage cars, to the young family next door with twin toddlers who were constantly escaping their yard. Crime wasn't even on our radar. Hell, I left my truck unlocked half the time, and Angela would leave her purse on the passenger seat when she ran into the grocery store. Everything changed when I came home from work that evening around 7 p.m. As I turned onto our street, I immediately noticed something was wrong. Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down was standing in her driveway, soaking wet from the rain, gesturing wildly at a police officer who was taking notes. Her garage door was wide open, and I could see boxes and tools scattered all over the concrete floor, like someone had ransacked the place. The cop car's red and blue lights were reflecting off the wet pavement, creating this eerie strobe effect that made the whole scene feel surreal. As I pulled into my driveway, Mrs. Patterson caught sight of me and came rushing over, her gray hair plastered to her head and her eyes wild with panic. "Jason, thank God you're here," she said, gripping my arm with both hands. "Someone broke into my garage in broad daylight. Took my husband's toolbox, the leaf blower, even the Christmas decorations from the back corner." The desperation in her voice was something I'd never heard before. This was a woman who usually complained about dandelions in her lawn, not someone who'd been violated in her own home. The officer, a young guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, finished up his report and told Mrs. Patterson he'd file it with the others. Others? That's when I learned this was the 5th break-in on our street in the past 2 weeks. The Hendersons had their shed cleaned out, the Garcias lost their lawn equipment, and apparently someone had even broken into the Miller's house while they were at church on Sunday, making off with jewelry and electronics. The cop mentioned they had no leads, no witnesses, and frankly, limited resources to investigate what seemed like random property crimes. After he left, Mrs. Patterson and I stood there in the drizzle, both of us realizing our little bubble of safety had been completely shattered. She kept talking about how violated she felt, how she'd never sleep well again knowing someone had been in her space, touching her things. I tried to comfort her, but honestly, I was starting to feel pretty uneasy myself. When I got inside, Angela was already making dinner, humming along to the radio like nothing had happened. But when I told her about the break-ins, I watched her face change from carefree to genuinely worried in about 2 seconds. The next morning, I found a handwritten note in my mailbox that would change everything. It was from someone named Captain Mitchell Broussard, a recently retired sheriff who'd moved to our neighborhood about 6 months earlier. I'd seen him around, tall, silver-haired guy with the kind of commanding presence that made you automatically respect him. The note was written in neat, precise handwriting and explained that he'd been monitoring the situation with the recent break-ins and wanted to organize a neighborhood watch group. He was inviting everyone on our street to a meeting at his house that Saturday evening to discuss security measures and coordinate our response to what he called this escalating criminal activity. The way he wrote made it sound official and urgent, like we were dealing with something much more serious than some opportunistic thieves. There was something about his tone that made me feel like finally someone with real experience was taking charge of the situation. Angela read the note over my shoulder and immediately said we should go. She'd been jumpy ever since I told her about the break-ins, double-checking the locks and asking me to walk her to her car when she left for work. The idea of having a retired law enforcement officer organizing our neighborhood's response felt like exactly what we needed. Saturday evening came, and nearly every house on our street was represented at Captain Broussard's meeting. His house was immaculate, the kind of place where every book on the shelf was perfectly aligned, and you could probably eat off the garage floor. He'd set up folding chairs in his living room, had coffee and store-bought cookies laid out, and even prepared a small presentation with charts showing the locations and times of each break-in. The guy was thorough, I'll give him that. He stood at the front of the room in his crisp button-down shirt and spoke with the kind of authority that came from decades of law enforcement experience. "Folks, what we're dealing with here isn't random," he said, pointing to his hand-drawn map of our neighborhood. "These crimes show a pattern. Someone who knows our routines, who understands when houses are empty, who's been watching us." The way he said, "watching us," sent a chill through the room. Mrs. Patterson nodded vigorously, and I could see other neighbors exchanging worried glances. Captain Broussard explained that the police were understaffed and overwhelmed, but that we could take proactive steps to protect ourselves and each other. His plan was comprehensive and, honestly, impressive. He suggested we create a phone tree for immediate communication, establish regular patrol schedules where volunteers would walk the neighborhood at different times, and most importantly, share our daily routines with each other so we'd know when someone should be home versus when their house would be empty. He even proposed installing additional security lights and suggested we all invest in better locks and security systems. The retired captain volunteered to coordinate everything, saying his experience made him the logical choice to lead our efforts. He handed out sheets where we could write down our work schedules, when we typically went grocery shopping, our usual church times, and any upcoming vacations or trips. The more we know about each other's movements, the better we can spot suspicious activity, he explained. It all made perfect sense, and by the end of the meeting, everyone was signed up to participate. Angela squeezed my hand as we walked home, saying she finally felt like we were doing something concrete to protect ourselves. Captain Broussard had given us hope that we could take back control of our neighborhood, and for the first time since the break-ins started, I actually slept well that night. The Neighborhood Watch program launched the following week, and initially it seemed to be working perfectly. Captain Broussard was incredibly organized. He created laminated cards with everyone's contact information, established specific patrol routes, and even set up a communication system using walkie-talkies he'd somehow acquired. Every morning he'd email the group with updates about any suspicious activity reported overnight, weather conditions that might affect our patrols, and reminders about upcoming schedule changes. The man was a machine when it came to organization. He knew when Mrs. Patterson went to her doctor appointments, when the Garcias worked late shifts, and when Mr. Vincent would be out of town visiting his daughter. He kept detailed logs of everything, which he said was crucial for identifying patterns and potential security gaps. The crazy part was that the break-ins completely stopped after we started the program. For 3 weeks, our neighborhood was quieter and safer than it had been in months. People were actually thanking Captain Broussard in the grocery store, and there was talk of expanding the program to include the streets adjacent to ours. Angela was sleeping better. I'd stopped checking the locks obsessively. And honestly, we all felt like we'd found the perfect solution to our problem. But then weird things started happening that didn't quite make sense. I was on patrol duty one evening around 9 p.m. when I noticed Captain Broussard's house was completely dark, which was unusual because he'd mentioned during that morning's email that he'd be home working on watch schedules. His car was in the driveway, but every window was black, and there was no glow from a television or computer screen. I figured maybe he'd gone to bed early, but something nagged at me about it. The next morning, he sent his usual update email, mentioning he'd spent the previous evening reviewing patrol logs and working on security improvements. When I casually mentioned during a conversation later that week that I'd noticed his house was dark during my patrol, he got this strange look on his face, just for a split second, before laughing it off and saying he'd probably been in his basement office with the blinds closed. It was such a minor thing, but it stuck with me because Captain Broussard was usually so precise about everything, and his explanations seemed almost rehearsed. Then Angela mentioned that she'd seen him at the grocery store on a day when he'd specifically told the group he'd be out of town visiting his sister. When she waved at him from across the parking lot, he seemed to quickly get in his car and drive away without acknowledging her, which was totally out of character for someone who usually went out of his way to chat with neighbors. The first real red flag came about a month into the program. I was getting home late from a job site, probably around 10:30 p.m., when I saw Captain Broussard walking down our street wearing all black clothes and carrying what looked like a small duffel bag. He was moving with purpose, not doing a casual patrol, and he was heading away from his house toward the end of our street where the newer families lived. The weird part was that according to our patrol schedule, he wasn't supposed to be on duty that night, and he'd never mentioned anything about doing additional solo patrols. I watched him from my truck for a few minutes, trying to figure out what he was doing, but he disappeared between 2 houses and I lost sight of him. The next morning, there was no mention of any late-night patrol activity in his usual email update, which was strange because he documented everything down to the smallest detail. When I brought it up during our weekly meeting, asking if we should coordinate late-night patrols better, he quickly dismissed it, saying he'd just been unable to sleep and decided to do a quick walk around the block. But his tone was defensive in a way I'd never heard before, and he immediately changed the subject to discussing new security light installations. A couple of other neighbors exchanged glances, and I could tell I wasn't the only one who thought his explanation sounded off. Then the break-ins started up again, but this time they were different, more targeted, more professional. The Hendersons got hit while they were at their daughter's wedding, an event that Captain Broussard definitely knew about because Mrs. Henderson had mentioned it during our last meeting and asked if someone could keep an extra eye on their house. The thieves knew exactly where to look for valuables, bypassing obvious items like the television, and instead taking jewelry from a hidden drawer in the bedroom and cash from a coffee can in the kitchen pantry. When the police investigated, they found no signs of forced entry, which meant whoever did it either had a key or was skilled enough to pick locks without leaving evidence. The timing was perfect too. The thieves struck during the exact window when the Hendersons were guaranteed to be away, almost like they'd had access to the detailed schedule information Captain Broussard had been collecting from all of us. During the emergency neighborhood meeting he called after the Henderson break-in, I watched his face carefully as he expressed outrage and concern about the escalating situation. He was saying all the right things, but there was something performative about his anger, like he was putting on a show rather than genuinely feeling violated on behalf of our neighbors. The way he kept pushing for more detailed schedule information from everyone, claiming we needed to be even more thorough about tracking our movements, started to feel less like security and more like surveillance. The truth came crashing down on a cold February morning when I was running late for work and forgot my lunch on the kitchen counter. I'd made it about halfway to the job site when I realized and had to turn around. As I pulled back onto our street, I saw Captain Broussard's car parked in the Vincentis' driveway, and I knew for a fact they were supposed to be in Atlanta visiting their son because he'd specifically mentioned it during our last phone tree check-in. My heart started pounding as I parked a few houses down and watched through my windshield. Captain Broussard was walking casually from their backyard toward his car, carrying a small bag and acting like he belonged there. When he saw my truck, he waved cheerfully and approached my window with that same confident smile he always wore during our meetings. "Just doing a security check on the Vincenti place," he said, but his explanation felt hollow and rushed. "Making sure everything looks secure while they're out of town." The way he kept glancing back at their house and the nervous energy radiating from him told a completely different story. I nodded and smiled, but as soon as he drove away, I called the police from my cell phone. The officer who responded found clear evidence of break-in tools in Captain Broussard's car during the traffic stop, along with items that had been reported stolen from various neighborhood break-ins over the past several months. The whole sick scheme unraveled within hours. Captain Broussard had been using our neighborhood watch as the perfect cover for his crimes, exploiting our trust and the detailed information we'd voluntarily given him about our schedules and security vulnerabilities. He'd studied our routines with the precision of a professional investigator, then used his law enforcement background to execute break-ins that left minimal evidence. The police found a detailed notebook in his house containing maps of every home on our street, lists of our work schedules, vacation plans, and even notes about where people kept spare keys or which windows might be easier to access. He'd been the fox guarding the henhouse, and we'd handed him everything he needed to rob us blind. The scariest part was how methodical he'd been. The early break-ins before he organized the watch group were just reconnaissance missions to establish a pattern of crime that would justify his neighborhood security efforts. Once he had our complete trust and detailed information about our lives, he could strike with surgical precision, knowing exactly when homes would be empty and what was worth stealing. During his confession, he admitted to orchestrating 8 different break-ins over a 4-month period, using our own fear and desire for safety as the perfect cover for his operation. The neighborhood watch disbanded immediately, and though he was eventually sentenced to 5 years in prison, the sense of violation went way deeper than just the stolen items. He'd weaponized our community spirit and turned our desire to protect each other into the very thing that made us vulnerable. Mercer, Oklahoma in 1995 was the kind of place where folks still measured time by harvest seasons and church bells. I was 24 that summer, fresh out of college with a teaching degree, and had just moved back home to help my aging parents run our small hardware store on Main Street. The town had maybe 800 people on a good day, the kind of place where everyone waved at each other and left their doors unlocked. My dad always said Mercer was God's country, untouched by the chaos of big cities, and I believed him. We had clean air, honest work, and the purest well water anyone could ask for. Crystal clear and ice cold, pumped straight from the aquifer that ran beneath our red dirt roads. Never once did we question what we were drinking. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on a scorching hot Wednesday morning in July. I was opening up the store when Mrs. Abernathy from the farmhouse 3 miles out came stumbling through our front door, her face pale as milk, and her usual bright floral dress stained with what appeared to be vomit. She was clutching her stomach with both arms, doubled over in obvious pain, and when she tried to speak, her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Something's wrong with the water," she managed to gasp between dry heaves. "Harold's in the hospital. The baby, too." The way she said it, with such raw terror in her eyes made my chest tighten. Mrs. Abernathy was tough as nails. I'd seen her wrangle cattle and fix fence posts in thunderstorms. But now she looked like she'd seen death itself. Within hours, the phone at our store wouldn't stop ringing. Families from all over the county were calling, desperate for answers, reporting the same horrific symptoms. The Petersons had rushed their twin daughters to the emergency room after they started vomiting blood. Old Mr. Fitzgerald collapsed on his porch and was found by his mailman, convulsing and frothing at the mouth. The Crawfords' livestock were dropping dead in their pastures, and their youngest son was having seizures. Every single call painted the same nightmarish picture. People drinking their morning coffee or giving their children a glass of water, then falling violently ill within hours. The hospital in the next town over was overwhelmed, with families driving in from every direction, carrying unconscious relatives and screaming children. The strangest part was the pattern. Not everyone in Mercer was getting sick, just certain families, scattered across specific areas of the county. My family was fine, as were the Whites who lived next door and the Kowalskis who ran the diner. But the affected families were all rural. All had their own wells and all lived in a rough horseshoe shape around the eastern edge of town. I remember staring at the map my dad had pinned to the wall behind our counter, marking each affected household with a red thumbtack. The pattern was too precise to be random, too deliberate to be coincidence. Something was targeting these specific families, and as the day wore on, more red thumbtacks appeared on that map, creating a crimson arc of suffering that made my skin crawl. The state health department arrived by Friday, a convoy of white vans and officials in hazmat suits who turned our quiet town into what felt like a disaster zone. They started testing everything: soil samples, water from every well, even the air we breathed. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the lead investigator, set up a makeshift command center in our high school gymnasium, and I volunteered to help coordinate with the local families. She was a sharp woman with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, and when she pulled me aside that evening, her expression was grave. "We've found industrial chemicals in the affected wells," she said quietly. "Trichloroethylene, benzene, heavy metals, stuff that shouldn't exist anywhere near a residential area. This isn't an accident or natural contamination. Someone is deliberately poisoning these people." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Someone in our community, someone we knew, someone we trusted, was systematically poisoning their neighbors. Dr. Hartwell explained that the chemicals were expensive industrial solvents, the kind used in manufacturing and metalworking, not something you'd find lying around a farm or small town. Whoever was doing this had access to dangerous materials and knew exactly what they were doing. The thought that one of our own could be capable of such calculated evil made me question everything I thought I knew about the people I'd grown up with. That night I couldn't sleep, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I'd unknowingly shaken hands with a monster, if I'd made small talk with someone who was slowly murdering children. The investigation took a disturbing turn when Dr. Hartwell's team discovered that the contamination wasn't random. It was surgical. Each affected well had been deliberately accessed, with tiny holes drilled near the wellheads and carefully concealed. The perpetrator had used a specialized drill bit, the kind used for precision work, and had somehow managed to inject the chemicals directly into the water supply without leaving obvious traces. This wasn't the work of some deranged amateur. This was planned, methodical, and executed with frightening expertise. The FBI was called in, and suddenly our little town was crawling with federal agents asking questions about everyone and everything. They set up surveillance equipment, conducted interviews, and started building profiles of every resident who might have the knowledge and means to carry out such an attack. What made it even more terrifying was the timeline. The contamination had been happening for weeks, maybe months, before anyone got sick enough to notice. The chemicals were being introduced in small doses, building up in people's systems gradually until they reached toxic levels. Some of the victims, particularly the elderly and children, were showing signs of permanent organ damage. Little Amy Peterson, who was only 7, had developed kidney problems that doctors said might never fully heal. The monster doing this wasn't just trying to make people sick. They were slowly, methodically destroying lives, families, and futures. The calculated cruelty of it all was almost impossible to comprehend, and I found myself studying the faces of everyone I met, wondering if they could be capable of such inhuman behavior. The breakthrough came on a rainy Monday morning when Agent Rebecca Stone knocked on our store door before we'd even opened. She was a compact woman with intense green eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that reminded me of my high school principal. "We need to talk about land ownership in this area," she said, spreading out a detailed survey map on our counter. "All the affected properties have something in common. They're all sitting on prime grazing land that borders the Whitmore Ranch." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Caleb Whitmore was one of the most respected men in the county, a third-generation rancher who owned over 2,000 acres of the best cattle land in eastern Oklahoma. He was a pillar of the community, served on the school board, and donated generously to the church. The idea that he could be behind this seemed absolutely impossible. But as Agent Stone laid out the evidence, a horrifying picture began to emerge. For the past 2 years, Whitmore had been quietly trying to buy up all the properties surrounding his ranch, making lowball offers that most families had rejected. The affected wells were all on properties he'd tried to purchase, and the contamination pattern perfectly matched the boundaries of the land he wanted to acquire. "He's been systematically poisoning his neighbors to force them off their properties," Agent Stone explained, her voice cold with disgust. "Once they're desperate enough, he swoops in with cash offers for their worthless, contaminated land. It's one of the most calculated real estate schemes we've ever seen." The realization that someone could orchestrate such elaborate suffering just to expand their business empire made me physically ill. This wasn't just about money. It was about a complete lack of human conscience. The arrest happened that very afternoon, and I'll never forget the scene. FBI agents surrounded Whitmore's ranch house while he was having lunch with his family, as if he were just another ordinary Tuesday. When they led him out in handcuffs, he looked genuinely confused, playing the part of an innocent man being wrongfully accused. But they'd found everything: barrels of industrial chemicals hidden in an old barn, drilling equipment with traces of the contaminated soil, and most damning of all, a detailed map showing exactly which wells he'd targeted and when. They also discovered he'd been purchasing the chemicals through a fake company he'd set up in Texas, using false documentation and paying in cash. The man who'd sat next to me at church every Sunday for 20 years had been living a double life as a calculated poisoner. What haunts me most is how easily he fooled all of us. Even after his arrest, when the evidence was overwhelming, part of me struggled to believe it was true. Whitmore had been the guy who helped neighbors fix their tractors, who brought casseroles to families when someone died, who coached Little League and organized the annual charity drive. The FBI found records showing he'd been planning this scheme for over 3 years, studying property values, researching the health effects of different chemicals, and carefully timing his attacks to maximize suffering while minimizing suspicion. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and every single affected family received substantial compensation. But the damage was done. Several people never fully recovered, and our community never felt the same. Trust, once broken on such a fundamental level, leaves scars that never completely heal. Even now, almost 30 years later, I still test my water regularly, and I still wonder about the people I thought I knew. Pine Valley, Idaho has always been the kind of town where secrets don't stay buried long. Everyone waves at each other from their pickup trucks, and the biggest excitement usually comes from arguing about which brand of fertilizer works best on corn. I became a registered nurse at Pine Valley Community Clinic in 2018, fresh out of nursing school and eager to help my neighbors. The clinic sat right on Main Street in this old brick building that Dr. Martinez had been running since the Carter administration. Most days we treated everything from scraped knees to high blood pressure, and the elderly folks in town treated us like family. Mrs. Rodriguez would bring us homemade cookies every Thursday, and old Mr. Stevens always asked about my mom's garden. It felt like the perfect place to build a career, until October 2023 changed everything I thought I knew about healing people. The trouble started with Diane Walsh, our head medical assistant who'd been there for almost 20 years. She was this soft-spoken woman in her 50s, with graying hair always pulled back in a neat bun, and these wire-rimmed glasses that made her look like everyone's favorite librarian. Diane knew every patient's medication history by heart, could draw blood from the most difficult veins, and had this gentle way of talking to scared kids that made them stop crying instantly. Dr. Martinez trusted her completely. She basically ran the day-to-day operations while he focused on diagnoses and treatment plans. All the elderly patients adored her because she'd sit with them during procedures, holding their hands and telling them stories about her grandchildren. If I had to pick the most caring person I'd ever met, Diane would have been at the top of that list, which is why what happened next still gives me nightmares. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Thursday morning in late October. I walked into the clinic around 7 a.m. to prep for our early appointments and found Diane already there, sitting in the break room with her coffee mug clutched between both hands. Her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, like she'd been crying, and she had this 1,000-yard stare that made my chest tighten. When I asked if she was okay, she just mumbled something about having a rough night and shuffled off to start her morning routine. That wasn't like her at all. Diane was usually the first one to crack jokes and ask about everyone's weekend plans. But lately, she'd been quieter, more withdrawn. I chalked it up to stress from her husband's recent cancer diagnosis, but deep down, something felt different about her energy. She moved through the clinic like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, and every time she thought no one was watching, her face would crumple into this expression of pure exhaustion. The real alarm bells started ringing when we lost 3 elderly patients in just 2 weeks. Now, Pine Valley had its share of folks in their 80s and 90s, so death wasn't exactly unusual, but these cases were different. Each one had been relatively stable when they came in for routine checkups, and each one passed away peacefully in their sleep within 48 hours of visiting our clinic. Mr. Grayson, who'd been managing his diabetes just fine, died on a Monday night. Mrs. Chen, who came in complaining about joint pain, passed away Wednesday evening. Then there was old Pete Murphy, who'd been joking about outliving his 3rd wife just days before he died quietly in his recliner. Their families were devastated, but grateful that their loved ones hadn't suffered. They all described the same thing. Their family members had seemed unusually calm and sleepy after their appointments, then simply never woke up the next morning. Dr. Martinez kept saying it was just one of those sad coincidences, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. What made everything worse was watching Diane's behavior become increasingly erratic. She'd started volunteering to handle all the medication preparations for our elderly patients, insisting that she wanted to take some burden off everyone else. During appointments, she'd disappear into the supply closet for unusually long periods, and when she emerged, she'd have this strange, almost serene expression on her face. I noticed she'd begun staying late after we closed, claiming she needed to organize patient files. But whenever I offered to help, she'd quickly decline and practically push me toward the door. The most unsettling part was how she'd started talking about our elderly patients differently. Instead of her usual warm, grandmotherly concern, she'd make these odd comments about how tired they looked, or how they seemed to be suffering more than they let on. When I mentioned that Mrs. Chen had seemed pretty cheerful during her last visit, Diane just shook her head and said something about people hiding their pain to protect their families. Her whole demeanor had shifted from nurturing to something that felt almost predatory, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon when I accidentally walked in on Diane preparing medications in the supply room. She was hunched over a small glass vial, using a syringe to draw up what looked like a clear liquid. Definitely not any of the standard medications we typically administered. When she heard me come in, she jumped like she'd been electrocuted and quickly shoved the vial into her pocket. Her face went completely white, and she started stammering about needing to double-check dosages for Mr. Williamson's blood pressure medication. But here's the thing. Mr. Williamson was scheduled for a routine physical, not any kind of injection or IV treatment. I asked her directly what was in the vial, and she gave me this long, rambling explanation about preparing emergency medications, just in case. But her voice was shaking and she wouldn't make eye contact. After she left the room, I checked our medication inventory and found that we were missing several vials of midazolam, a powerful sedative that, in high doses, could easily stop someone's breathing. That's when the horrible truth started clicking into place, and I realized I might be working alongside a killer. I spent the entire weekend in a panic, trying to figure out what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to believe I was jumping to conclusions. After all, this was Diane, the woman who'd taught me how to properly comfort grieving families and who still sent birthday cards to former patients. But the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. I started going through our recent patient files, cross-referencing the elderly patients who died with their appointment times, and discovered a chilling pattern. Every single one of them had been scheduled for late afternoon appointments when most of the staff had already gone home, leaving just Diane and Dr. Martinez in the building. More disturbing was the fact that all of these patients had received vitamin B12 injections, according to their charts, something that wasn't part of their usual treatment plans. When I called their families to offer condolences, several mentioned that their loved ones had seemed unusually drowsy and peaceful after their appointments, describing them as ready to go and at peace with everything. The picture that emerged was absolutely terrifying. Diane had been systematically identifying patients she believed were suffering, then administering lethal doses of sedatives under the guise of routine care. The confrontation happened on Monday morning when I couldn't stand the weight of my suspicions anymore. I arrived early and found Diane already preparing for the day, methodically laying out supplies with that same eerie calm she'd been displaying for weeks. I told her I knew what she'd been doing, and instead of denying it or acting shocked, she just sat down heavily in her chair and started crying. Through her tears, she confessed everything, how she'd been watching these elderly patients struggle with pain and illness, how their families seemed so exhausted from caregiving, and how she'd convinced herself that she was performing acts of mercy. She kept repeating that she was helping them find peace, and that she couldn't bear to watch them suffer anymore. The most chilling part was when she described the process, how she'd wait until Dr. Martinez was busy with other patients, then administer the midazolam injections while holding their hands and whispering that everything would be okay. She genuinely believed she was being compassionate, and the complete disconnect between her intentions and her actions made my skin crawl. Here was someone I'd trusted completely, someone who'd taught me about patient care, and she'd been playing God with people's lives while convincing herself she was saving them. What happened next was the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my entire life. I told Diane that I had to report what she'd confessed, and she just nodded like she'd been expecting it. She didn't beg me to keep quiet or try to justify her actions further. She just sat there looking utterly defeated, like all the fight had drained out of her. When I called the police, my voice was shaking so badly that the dispatcher had to ask me to repeat myself 3 times. Within an hour, our quiet little clinic was swarming with investigators, and Diane was being led away in handcuffs while news crews gathered outside. The whole thing felt surreal. Just that morning, she'd been preparing to help patients, and by noon she was being charged with multiple counts of murder. Dr. Martinez was absolutely devastated when he found out. He kept saying he should have noticed something, but honestly, Diane had been so careful that even someone paying close attention might have missed the signs. The families of the deceased patients were torn between grief and anger. Some felt betrayed that their loved ones had been murdered, while others admitted they were almost relieved their family members had died peacefully instead of suffering through prolonged illness. The investigation revealed that Diane had killed at least 7 elderly patients over the course of 3 months, all with overdoses of midazolam administered during routine appointments. The authorities found detailed notes in her car where she'd written about each patient's suffering and her reasons for helping them transition. Some of the entries were absolutely heartbreaking. She described sitting with terminal cancer patients and feeling overwhelmed by their pain, or watching family members struggle with the emotional and financial burden of caring for aging relatives. In her twisted logic, she thought she was providing a service that the medical system couldn't offer, ending suffering before it became unbearable. The most disturbing part was how methodical she'd been. She'd researched the exact dosages needed to cause respiratory failure, timed her injections to coincide with busy periods when Dr. Martinez was distracted, and even practiced her explanations for why patients seemed sleepy after their appointments. She'd turned mercy killing into a carefully planned operation, all while maintaining the facade of being the clinic's most compassionate caregiver. The trial lasted 6 months, and I had to testify about what I'd witnessed and how I'd discovered the missing medications. Diane pleaded guilty to 7 counts of second-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. During her sentencing, she gave this long speech about how she'd been trying to spare families the agony of watching their loved ones deteriorate, and how the medical system had failed these patients by keeping them alive when they were ready to die. Even then, she maintained that her actions had been motivated by compassion rather than malice. The judge wasn't buying it. He called her a predator who'd exploited the trust of vulnerable patients and their families, and said that her delusions of mercy didn't excuse the fact that she'd committed cold-blooded murder. Watching her get sentenced was simultaneously satisfying and heartbreaking, because I could see glimpses of the woman who'd been my mentor, the one who'd taught me to always put patients first. It was like watching 2 completely different people occupy the same body, and I still struggle to reconcile the caring colleague I'd known with the killer she'd become. The Pine Valley Community Clinic never reopened after the scandal. Dr. Martinez retired immediately, saying he couldn't trust himself to properly supervise staff after missing such obvious warning signs. The building sits empty now, with a for sale sign that's been there for over a year. Most of our elderly patients had to drive 40 minutes to the next town for medical care, and several families moved away entirely because they couldn't handle the constant reminders of what had happened. I transferred to a hospital in Boise, but I still have nightmares about finding those missing medication vials and wondering how many other patients might have died if I hadn't discovered Diane's secret. The hardest part is that I understand on some level what drove her to do it. Watching people suffer is brutal, and the desire to help them find peace is natural for anyone in healthcare. But there's a line between compassion and murder, and Diane crossed it 7 times while convincing herself she was doing the right thing. I'll never forget the look on her face when she confessed, that mixture of guilt and self-righteousness that made me realize how dangerous good intentions can become when they're not tempered by respect for human life and choice. The summer of 1993 in Milford changed everything about how I see the world. At 28, I was living what most people would call a simple life, shift supervisor at the local cheese processing plant, making sure our small town's pride and joy kept churning out those wheels of cheddar that made us famous across Wisconsin. Every morning at 5 a.m., I'd wake up in my little rental house on Elm Street, work until 3 p.m., then come home to tinker with my motorcycle in the garage or read whatever paperback I'd picked up from the library. Milford was one of those places where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the biggest excitement was usually the county fair, or when someone's livestock got loose. The most scandalous thing that had happened in years was when Mrs. Thornton's chickens somehow ended up in the church basement during Bible study. That's the kind of predictable, quiet existence I thought I'd signed up for when I left Milwaukee behind. The whole thing started on a Wednesday morning in late June. The air still held that perfect summer coolness, smelling like fresh-cut grass and wildflowers from the fields surrounding town. I was getting ready for work, had just finished my coffee and was reaching for my keys when I heard the familiar rumble of the mail truck coming down the street. Nothing unusual about that. Our mailman always made his rounds right around 7:30. But when I stepped outside to grab the mail before heading to the plant, there was something different in my box alongside the usual bills and grocery store circulars. A plain manila envelope with no return address, just my name written in block letters across the front. The handwriting was neat, almost mechanical, like someone had taken great care to make sure every letter was perfectly formed. Inside that envelope was a cassette tape, the kind you'd buy at any drugstore with a white label that simply read, "Listen." I almost threw the thing away, figured it was some kind of prank or maybe a local band trying to get their music heard. But curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to pop it into my old boombox when I got home from work that evening. The first few seconds were just static, that familiar hiss you get from cheap recording equipment. Then I heard voices, 2 voices actually, having what sounded like a private conversation. At first I thought maybe someone had accidentally recorded over a blank tape, caught some radio show or TV program. But as I kept listening, the voices became clearer, more distinct. One was a woman's voice, soft and concerned, asking about doctor appointments and medication schedules. The other was an elderly man, his voice shaky and tired, talking about his arthritis acting up and how he'd been having trouble sleeping. The conversation was so mundane, so personal that it felt wrong to be listening. But then the woman said something that made my spine tingle. "Dad, I wish you'd let me move that old radio from your bedroom. It's been acting up lately, making weird noises at night." The tape continued for another 10 minutes, capturing what was obviously a private conversation between a daughter and her elderly father. They talked about grocery shopping, his physical therapy appointments, and whether he needed help with his medication. Normal, everyday stuff that families discuss behind closed doors. But hearing it played back on this anonymous tape felt deeply invasive, like I was eavesdropping on something sacred. The quality was surprisingly good too, not like someone had held a tape recorder up to a window, but crisp and clear, as if the microphone had been right there in the room with them. When the tape finally ended, I sat there staring at the boombox, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. Who would record such a private conversation? And more importantly, why would they send it to me? I didn't recognize the voices, though something about the woman's tone reminded me of someone I might have met around town. The whole thing left me with an uneasy feeling that I couldn't quite shake, like I'd accidentally stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to know about. The next morning at work, I couldn't concentrate on anything. While checking the production line, my mind kept wandering back to that tape. During my lunch break, I found myself talking to Carl, one of the older guys who'd lived in Milford his whole life. I didn't mention the tape directly, just asked him if he'd heard about anything strange happening around town lately. Carl scratched his graying beard and said that his neighbor, Mrs. Henley, had been acting paranoid recently, claiming someone was watching her house. He also mentioned that the Webbers down on Main Street had been arguing more than usual, loud enough that people walking by could hear them from the sidewalk. At the time, I thought it was just typical small-town gossip, but now I wonder if those arguments were happening because they'd received their own mysterious tapes. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that I wasn't the only one who'd gotten an unwanted delivery. There was something systematic about the whole thing, too organized to be a random prank. That evening, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, hoping to clear my head and maybe spot something unusual. Milford had always been the kind of place where people left their windows open on summer nights, where you could hear the faint sounds of dinner conversations and television shows drifting from house to house. But as I walked past the familiar homes on Elm Street, I started paying attention to details I'd never noticed before. The Sandersons had a new ceramic garden gnome sitting by their front porch, one of those kitschy things you'd find at a garage sale or flea market. The Mitchells had recently hung a decorative wind chime near their kitchen window, and I could see through the glass that they were having dinner at their small table. Mrs. Carmichael's house had a new wooden birdhouse mounted on her fence post, painted bright blue with yellow trim. All of these were innocent enough decorations, the kind of things people pick up to brighten their yards. But seeing them all together, clustered in the same few blocks, made me realize that a lot of folks had been shopping at the same places recently. The monthly flea market at the community center had been particularly busy this summer, with vendors bringing in all sorts of household items and garden decorations. Friday morning brought another tape. This one was different. Instead of one conversation, it contained fragments of multiple recordings, like someone had spliced together bits and pieces from different homes. I heard a man complaining about his boss while doing dishes, a woman on the phone with her sister discussing her husband's drinking problem, and even what sounded like a couple having an intimate conversation in their bedroom. The audio quality was consistently excellent across all the recordings, with that same crisp clarity that suggested professional equipment. But what really disturbed me was recognizing one of the voices. It was Janet from the post office, talking to someone about her daughter's college tuition payments. I'd stood behind Janet in line at the grocery store just last week, and her distinctive laugh was unmistakable. The realization hit me like a physical blow. These weren't random strangers, these were my neighbors, people I saw every day around town. Someone was systematically recording private conversations in homes throughout Milford, and they were distributing the evidence like some sick form of entertainment. That afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I drove straight to the sheriff's office, clutching both tapes in a paper bag. Sheriff Morrison was a decent guy, someone I'd shared a few beers with at the annual firefighters fundraiser, but when I tried to explain what I'd found, he looked at me like I'd lost my mind. He listened to about 30 seconds of the first tape, then handed it back with a shrug. "Could be anybody, Tom," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Maybe someone's got a police scanner picking up phone conversations. Or maybe it's just actors, people making up stories for some kind of radio show project." I tried to argue that these were real conversations, that I'd recognized Janet's voice, but he wasn't buying it. The sheriff's attitude was frustrating but not entirely surprising. Milford was the kind of place where serious crimes just didn't happen, where the biggest law enforcement challenge was usually breaking up fights at the tavern on Saturday nights. He promised to look into it if I brought him something more concrete, but I could tell he thought I was wasting his time. Walking out of that office, I realized I was on my own with this mystery. Over the weekend, I started doing my own investigation. I began by visiting the community center where the monthly flea market was held, hoping to find some clues about recent vendors or unusual items that had been sold. The center's volunteer coordinator, an elderly woman named Doris, was surprisingly helpful when I explained that I was looking for information about decorative items and household goods. She pulled out a thick binder filled with vendor registration forms and receipts from the past few months. As we flipped through the pages, one name kept appearing repeatedly: Hartley Electronics and Collectibles. According to the records, this vendor had been selling refurbished radios, decorative items with built-in speakers, novelty clocks, and even some garden ornaments with small weather monitoring devices. The vendor had been particularly active during the past 2 months, always setting up in the same corner spot near the back entrance. Doris remembered him as a quiet, middle-aged man who wore thick glasses and always paid his table fees in cash. He'd told her he was cleaning out his late father's electronics repair shop, selling off old inventory and personal collections. The more I learned about this Hartley character, the more convinced I became that he was behind the tapes. I started making a list of all the homes where I'd noticed new flea market purchases, cross-referencing them with the conversations I'd heard on the recordings. The pattern was becoming clear. Every house that had received items from the flea market seemed to be represented on those tapes. But what really made my skin crawl was the realization that this wasn't random surveillance. It was targeted. Someone had deliberately planted listening devices in household items, knowing that people would bring them into their most private spaces. The ceramic gnomes, the decorative radios, the wind chimes, even the birdhouses, they were all potential hiding spots for tiny microphones. I spent Sunday afternoon walking through my neighborhood again, this time with a notebook, documenting every new decoration or household item I could spot. The evidence was overwhelming. At least 24 homes had purchased items from the flea market in recent months, and I was willing to bet that every single one of those families had received their own anonymous tapes. Monday morning, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I called in sick to work and drove to the addresses listed on Hartley's vendor registration forms. The first address was a rundown house on the outskirts of town, with newspapers piled up on the front porch and mail overflowing from the mailbox, clearly abandoned. The second address led me to a vacant lot where a house had obviously been demolished months earlier. But the third address was different. It was a legitimate electronics repair shop on the other side of the county, about 30 miles from Milford. When I walked in, the owner, an older man named Bob, immediately recognized the name I mentioned. He explained that someone calling himself Hartley had rented storage space in his back room about 4 months ago, paying cash up front for 3 months. The man had claimed he was dealing with an estate sale and needed temporary storage for electronics and collectibles. Bob described him as nervous and secretive, someone who always came by after hours to access his stored items. The storage rental had expired 2 weeks ago, and when the man didn't show up to renew or collect his belongings, Bob had opened the unit to find it completely empty, except for some wire clippings and a few electronics catalogs. Armed with this information, I returned to Milford and did something I'd never done before. I went door to door, talking to neighbors about the mysterious tapes. To my surprise, almost everyone I spoke with had received at least one. The Sandersons had gotten 3 different tapes, all containing recordings of their dinner conversations and phone calls. Mrs. Carmichael had received a tape with her private prayers recorded from her bedroom. The Mitchells had gotten recordings of their arguments about money and their discussions about their son's troubles at school. Once people started opening up, the full scope of the violation became clear. We'd all been living in our homes, thinking we were safe and private, while someone had been systematically recording our most intimate moments. The anger in the neighborhood was palpable, but it was mixed with a deep sense of helplessness. The man called Hartley had vanished, the sheriff wasn't taking us seriously, and we were left with the unsettling knowledge that our private lives had been broadcast to strangers. That evening, about 15 of us met at the community center to figure out what to do next. We decided to systematically check every item purchased from the flea market, and what we found confirmed our worst fears. Tiny microphones hidden in electronic devices, speakers wired to transmit instead of receive, and even some garden decorations with sophisticated recording equipment disguised as weather sensors. We spent the next week removing and destroying every suspicious item we could find, but the damage was already done. The sense of security we'd all taken for granted was gone forever. I was working maintenance for the County Roads Division back then. Nothing thrilling, just long days patching asphalt and clearing brush along the back highways near Lisbon. The kind of job where you knew everyone by name, or at least by truck. That morning, I had clocked in around 6, and by mid-afternoon I was finishing up near County Road 18, close to one of those rest stops no one ever really uses. You know the type. 2 cracked picnic tables, a faded vending machine that probably hadn't worked since the 90s, and a single bathroom that somehow always smelled like mildew and bleach at the same time. I'd driven past it 100 times, never thought twice. That day, though, something felt wrong. Not eerie or dramatic, just off routine. Around 4, I noticed a cruiser parked crooked at the far end of the lot, half in the grass. It was one of ours. Sheriff's Department. At first, I thought maybe the deputy inside had pulled over to take a nap or make a call. But as I passed by in the truck, I realized the driver's side door was hanging open. The lights weren't flashing, but the engine was idling, and the radio was still squawking with dispatch chatter, like someone had just stepped out for a second and never came back. No one else was around. I got out, walked over, called out a couple times. Hello? and peeked inside. No sign of anyone. The laptop mount was still logged in, a bottle of water in the cup holder, half empty. I recognized the name on the screen, Deputy Lane Kessler, young guy, polite, only been on the force maybe a year or two, but people liked him. The last time I saw him was at the diner off Route 1. He bought a coffee for an old vet who didn't have enough change. That kind of guy. Always waved when he passed. It didn't make sense that he'd leave his car like that. It didn't fit him. I didn't touch anything. I backed up, called the non-emergency number and told them exactly what I saw. While I waited, I kept scanning the tree line. The rest stop backs up against an old cornfield on one side and a cluster of woods on the other, dense with those thick, clawing branches that always seem to block the light, even at noon. I didn't see movement, but the silence felt heavy. Not the peaceful kind, more like the world was holding its breath. Within 20 minutes, 2 patrol units pulled in, followed by an unmarked SUV. That's when everything started spiraling fast. They taped off the area quick. I stood back near my truck while one of the deputies asked me to go over what I saw, how long the car had been there, whether I noticed any other vehicles, people, anything strange. But honestly, it was just empty when I got there. Not even tire tracks that looked fresh besides mine and the cruiser's. The weird part was the passenger door. It had a smudge near the handle, like someone with dirty gloves had touched it. Almost greasy, hard to miss in the sunlight. I mentioned it, but I don't know if they ever found anything off it. They kept circling the area, but it was all just grass, cracked pavement, and trees that didn't talk back. That night, the town Facebook page lit up. Rumors spread fast. Some folks said he got ambushed. Others claimed they saw a white van parked near the rest stop the night before. You know how people get when there are no answers. They fill in the blanks themselves. But one thing stuck out. No one saw him after midnight. His last radio log showed he called in a routine check just before 12:40 a.m. Then nothing. No distress call, no follow-up. Just radio silence until I found the car almost 4 hours later. Whatever happened fast, clean, quiet. Over the next few days, the search ramped up. Helicopters scanned the fields. Dogs were brought in, volunteers combed the woods. I joined the Saturday morning grid search and spent hours walking between rows of corn that reached up to my shoulders. The whole time, it felt like we were looking for someone who wasn't there anymore. Not just missing, gone, like he'd been plucked out of the world and erased. No footprints, no blood, no broken branches. But some of the guys whispered about a clearing deeper in the woods, one that wasn't marked on any of the maps. They said it looked like people had been gathering there. By the time Monday rolled around, the sheriff's department had shifted their tone. It wasn't a missing persons case anymore. They brought in federal agents and we stopped getting updates. But word travels. One of my buddies from county road crew, Brent, said he'd seen trucks pulling off that exit late at night for months. Box trucks, no markings. Never stayed long. Always in and out before dawn. We all thought it was just construction crews or supply runs. Now it looked more like something organized, coordinated. And maybe Nick, Deputy Kessler, had caught a glimpse of something he wasn't supposed to. A week after the disappearance, a farmer named Len Harbin found a jacket buried under a pile of brush near the south fence of his property, about 2 miles from the rest stop, not visible from the road. It was standard sheriff's issue, name tag still attached. They never said it publicly, but word was there was blood on the collar. That's when everything locked down even more. Len said unmarked trucks showed up that same afternoon, and by evening, the brush was cleared. The soil was tested and a huge section of his land was marked off. He told me later that they'd found tire impressions leading into a dirt trail he didn't even know existed, like it had been used and covered again. Deputy Kessler's body was never found, not officially. But about a month after everything settled down, I got a message on Facebook from someone I didn't know. No profile picture, no mutual friends. Just a short message. He did the right thing. Don't talk to anyone else about that day. I'll be honest, I didn't sleep that night. I deleted the message, logged off, and didn't bring it up again until now. Maybe I should have gone to someone with it, but part of me figured they already knew. Whoever they are. Eventually, the department held a memorial for him. Full honors. His mom spoke. The whole town showed up, lining Main Street in silence while the cruisers rolled by, lights spinning slowly. I stood near the back and watched, but I couldn't stop thinking about that cruiser sitting there with the door open, like he'd stepped out just for a second. Like he thought whatever he saw wasn't going to be a problem. Whatever operation was happening out there, whether it was trafficking, weapons, something else, it was big enough to make a person disappear without a trace, and quiet enough that most people still don't believe it happened the way it did. I still drive by that rest stop sometimes, usually early mornings on my way out to patch potholes or salt the roads in winter. It looks the same, empty. The vending machine's gone now, just a concrete slab where it used to be. But every time I slow down, I catch myself checking the edge of the trees, the brush beyond the guardrail, half expecting someone to step out. I never stop. Not anymore. Whatever was out there that night, it made sure to clean up after itself. But it left just enough behind for the rest of us to remember and to stay quiet.